Hello everyone, Darth here, and welcome back to another overly analytical group podcast. So my goal for this video was to assemble a group of media critics and to have each of them teach me exactly how they analyze a story. I have a degree in film, but most of my analyses stem from just like logic and process flow. Y doesn't work because X wasn't set up properly. But I've always wanted to see how actual writers like these guys go about analyzing a story. Down in the description, you're going to find a list of basic terminology that we will frequently be using. So if you want to go on and review that before you actually start the video, we probably won't stop and define every term. But this episode is going to start covering the basic world building, tone setting, character introductions, and then future episodes will cover character and plot development, dialogue, scene structure, stuff like that. So without further ado, let's meet everyone. I'm Darth. I've got a bachelor's in film, and from high school through college, our group's biggest hobby was filmmaking. I've produced, edited, and directed something like 32 short films, a couple of placed second place in different competitions. We've gone to Sidewalk Film Festival. I interned with the Irwin brothers, so I've actually seen how films work firsthand on set, which was a really great experience. And for the past 3 years, I've taken those skills and transferred them into my YouTube channel, which is focusing mainly on video essays within the Star Wars niche. Brother.
Hi, my name is Eric Anderson. I have a master's degree in English. That's a great start. All right.
Do you want to go out, workshop it, come back in?
Maybe.
Well, he's not drinking water. That's the problem. He has something a little harder.
I don't know what it is. It was handed to me before we began.
In the Darth'd studio, the mysterious fluid.
This is just Darth juice. Oh no.
Yo, that's a good branding opportunity, man.
Too far. Maybe. All right.
That's the first swag you
We'll
dropped.
work on the
Darth'd
koozies
juice.
later for next time. My name is Eric Anderson. I have a master's degree in English language and literature. I'm an author. My most recent book is called The Boy Who Shook the Hawthorn Tree, wherein a college freshman discovers that the wizard Merlin is trapped in a hawthorn tree next to his rental house, and then hijinks ensue. I'm also the co-host of our brand new podcast, season 1 just dropped, called Diamonds in the Rough Draft, where my wife and I go back through our writings, because she's a writer as well. We go back through our writings from our childhood, like really early bad poems and bad short stories. And we talk about them when we talk about their merits, and then we redo them, and then we read those redone writings on an open mic night.
Cool. All right, next up we have David, the author of Maynard Trigg.
Oh, you stealing? Because that's what I was going to open with. Shit. I'm DC McNeil. My human name is David. I'm the author of the Maynard Trigg series. I'm also the editor-in-chief at Zero Indent. I've been around on the internet making media crit for almost 8 years now, which is horrifying to think about. I started my career in this space writing satirical fan fiction, and have made my way into actually making real things. A lot of my work in the past kind of 5 to 6 years has been around how do you take media criticism and not just make it accessible, but keep growing it and elevating it. And really wish I had a more poignant point to end on. I write a lot of stuff and I talk a lot about this sort of thing.
Cool. Pat?
Hi, I'm Patrick. I also have a bachelor's in film. A lot of good that's done me. The thing I'm most proud of, though, is that I have a film podcast that I do with my friend Mitchie. We analyze films and take a more philosophical approach to it, and our mission statement is pretty much the same as Zero Indent, which is just media crit that's, smarter and not shallow.
What's the podcast name?
Oh, A Method to the Madness. Right. Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Now we've got all our introductions. We're going to try to keep to a roughly strict schedule so that we don't end up with another 7-hour video like we did with our solo podcast.
How dare you? Wow. What are you trying to say, Darth?
We said we wouldn't speak of it.
Yeah. That was in my media release when I agreed to come on this show. I said, you don't bring that up in front of me.
All right, so we've got, our goal is to have each of us have a 10-minute analysis followed by 20 minutes of group discussion. So David, if you want to go on and kick us off.
Yeah, definitely. So I don't know if you already kind of framed it, but this episode we're kind of talking about openings and the way that you begin stories. one of the scenes that I'm going to be tackling, or the scene I'm going to be tackling, kind of two parts, is the opening to the first Guardians of the Galaxy movie. And I'm going to be kind of breaking down how that functions and kind of why it works, in my opinion, as well as some of the theory behind the way that they constructed that scene. So I guess I'll kind of set the table and explain a bit about the scene. I'm sure on screen you'll be seeing different imagery and things like that. But basically, the scene plays out like this in kind of two parts. So Guardians opens with this prologue where we see a very young Peter Quill, who is grappling with his mother's declining cancer. She seems like she is, at the end of her journey toward terminal cancer. During this process, as she's kind of, on her deathbed, she gives Peter a Walkman with a mixtape with some classic kind of 70s and 80s chins. And sort of, in her last moments of cognizance with her son, she kind of reaches out to Peter, offering a hand. I need you to be with me. But he actually runs away. And as he runs away, he's abducted by a UFO, taken from Earth into space. We then hard cut to now. We do get a title card. We cut to now. And in the now, we see a grown Peter Quill landing on a foreign planet, searching for some kind of treasure. Peter puts on his Walkman and he's listening to this, these amazing tunes while he dances around and kicks small animals for fun on his way to this location where he's going to claim his prize. And he does eventually kind of reach this kind of temple where this old kind of treasure resides. And he's going there to grab it and steal it. And just as he does, he's confronted by these scary-looking mercenaries. And as they confront him, he kind of asks them, "Hey, do you know who I am?" And they're like, "Listen, man, we're just some goons. We don't know who the fuck you are." And he's like, "No, but you might know me by my other name, Star-Lord." And they just stare at him blankly. Peter does escape and beats these guys. And this is kind of the thrust of our story, is we now have the treasure at play. And I guess from a trying to break down what this is trying to do, really these two pieces achieve two very different but tremendously interlinked things. So I guess this prologue sets up a few items that we need to understand for this movie to function. And I'll kind of talk about them in sequence here. So there's really kind of our aspects of what is the story going to be about, so both thematically and the objects in space that we'll be tracking. And then there's also the world building aspect. What world does this take place in? What are the rules here? What laws govern this kind of environment, whether that be physics, whether that be, actual kind of legislative laws, that sort of thing. So I guess the first thing it sets up really, really early on is Peter's arc, where his mother is kind of offering her hand, and she's sort of offering him this opportunity to cross the threshold into adulthood. She's kind of saying, "Look, I need you to be with me. This is your opportunity to kind of grow. I need you to be an adult with me." And in his juvenilism, he's unable to accept or cross that threshold. And we see this directly mirrored when we cut to the now, where, he's kicking animals for fun. That's kind of fucked up. That's like a kid with a magnifying glass with ants, it's very juvenile to do that kind of behavior. More so that he's dancing to music while doing it. He sort of makes a spectacle of this activity. So we see that he hasn't yet accepted that crossing of the threshold, even now as a 20-something-year-old handsome Chris Pratt, right? We also get the music and the Walkman. I think the music basically, as a continual through line for this series and this story, the music is great because it both represents a gift from his mother, but also a comfort in the shadow of his refusal. So the idea that the one thing he's left with after refusing the call is the music she's left him. It's kind of the last bastion of his childhood that he's desperately holding on to the extent where he's very overly protective about the Walkman. He defends that tape with his entire life. And of course, this music and dancing ends up being the very thing that saves the day at the end of the narrative as well. So we both get the setup of the themes, which is, him crossing the threshold, but also the payoff of the music and the dancing being things that, while childish, are directly assets that Peter has retained and developed that make him kind of a unique actor in this world. And I guess before I jump into world building, I did just want to say the other kind of arc here is obviously his, crossing that threshold to adulthood. At the end of the film, during that climax, Peter crosses the threshold into adulthood by accepting that he can't do everything by himself, that he does in fact need family and friends. We actually get the imagery come back of the mother extending her hand, but it's mirrored with Gamora. I would like to really clearly delineate, though, Peter doesn't become an adult by the end of the movie. What he does is accept that he needs to continue growing. The second film is the exploration of how does Peter become a more actualized person. What does becoming an adult look like? So it's not like, it's not a coverall. He doesn't just do the thing and get the girl, which is I think what everybody wanted and why some people found Guardians too frustrating. He has a long way to go, but it's the start of that journey into adulthood for Peter's character. And then I guess touching on the world building, which is the other axiom this deals with quite neatly. We learn a lot of stuff really quickly. Peter's from Earth, but there's spaceships and shit. It's out here. It's crazy. He's got a space mask thing and these cool like rocket boots, and like he seems very comfortable and competent in space. So it seems to me, and it seems to us as the viewer, that like humans are not in all ever-present danger in space. They kind of fit in. They're able to participate in combat pretty handily. And we also learn that there's mercenaries on the hunt for this object of power, which becomes our central focus for the movie, is these stones. But in doing so, we learn that there's bad guys who want it, and that then feeds into later in the narrative. We learn a bit more about them. So we've actually got every kind of physical force of antagonism and protagonism in this story within about 5 minutes. We understand someone took Peter, so that's going to be a force of antagonism, is who took him away from his mother. We have Peter himself representing the Guardians of the Galaxy and the quote-unquote good guys. And then we also have, our mercenaries, our bad guys, seeded into the story, and everybody's after the same MacGuffin. So it neatly sets up everything without really feeling like it's forced. And then on top of that, we also get, this nice addendum that Peter wants to be, a Kevin Bacon type hero. He wants to be like Indiana Jones style, which is pretty fun. I think the other thing I really wanted to talk about before we jump into the group discussion is I separate the prologue and the intro for a reason. So in this story in particular, the prologue occurs outside of the 5-act structure. So the 5-act structure of this story essentially starts with the inciting incident, which is Peter getting that, going into that temple and discovering that object of power. What's the fucking stone called?
The Power Stone.
Is it the Power Stone? Fuck, I was calling it an object of power. My brain broke. Yeah, the Power Stone. The inciting incident is Peter uncovering that, and it sets into motion the events of our narrative. The events that occur before that title card with Peter's mother are purely thematic and character setup. They're not actually related to the external structure of the narrative. They are starting the internal structure of that narrative. So you get both the external and the internal genre setup. And I guess to clarify the difference, the internal genre is going to be the emotional arc of your characters. So for example, in a thriller, that's, safety to mortality to damnation to salvation. In a story like this, which is your basic kind of Joseph Campbell's, hero's journey, you go from refusing the call to accepting the call, testing allies, gaining skills, recrossing the threshold, and realizing you're changed. And the advantage we get here is that in Peter's arc, what's kind of fascinating to me is that it's not necessarily that he doesn't, at the end of this story, complete the arc of becoming the adult. Instead, he's completing the arc of realizing that this Power Stone and the tools at play in this universe are about more than just his pride and his fame. Like, his arc really is learning to accept that there are greater forces than him, and he needs to put himself, or lease out his safety to the galaxy to defend it. That's ultimately Peter's arc here, and he realizes he can only do so with his friends and family that he makes along the way. But his actual narrative arc is not, I've redeemed myself in the eyes of my mother. That comes later. And yeah, I think it's a really neat kind of way to approach setting up, your longer character arc for this Star-Lord character across your movies. But then also just really clearly delineating, like, okay, your story starts here. The second he gets into that temple, that's when we know the shit's going to hit the fan, and everything kind of kicks off. But yes, this has been my TED Talk. Thank you for coming. I think this is one of my favorite opening intros of any movie, and it's also one of my favorite movies of any movie.
Hell yeah.
Hell yeah.
Okay.
David, when you talk about the 5-act structure, who are you referencing?
As in which theorist?
Yeah.
I'm just cribbing off Blake Snyder. So in that
Save
case,
the Cat?
Yeah, Save the Cat. So when he's talking about his acts, because he has that basic 5-act kind of, he calls them beats, but yeah, I would use the word act. Between him and Sean Coyne, those are kind of the two guys that peddle that 5-act piece the most, I think.
I was going to ask that too, because I've always heard of a 3-act structure, although I think I've heard them talk about 5 more just when there's more stuff in the story and they're trying to break up what's going on more.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so the weird thing about 3 and 5 act structures, particularly when we talk about introductions, is that the reason the 5 act structure is a more meaningful, like, dramatic tool is that that's something that comes from the Shakespearean era, where instead of 3 acts, which is what you had in Greek tragedies, Shakespeare looked toward the 5 act. And the reason the 5 act structure works a bit better for drama instead, so you have like what we in the West would call drama now, which is like thrillers and like action and like like the emotional stakes and like the stories are interesting and exciting and prestige TV and Mad Men. But then back then, when they talked about drama, what they meant is like high drama, like the Grecian drama, where it's like you're dealing with the gods, and there are these epic and mythologic stories, and in that context, those are 3 act stories because they're quite simple, because they need to be, because they're dealing with kind of quite complex mythology and themes. So the narrative stays quite straightforward. Whereas I think in particularly in the modern American novel, if you look to a lot of the things that have made Stephen King quite successful, the 5 act structure gives you a lot more flexibility with how you execute on those acts. So in a 3 act structure, you have like your beginning, your middle, and your end, right? It's pretty straightforward. But your 5 act structure, you get a lot more flexibility. You have like your inciting incident, your progressive complication, then you have your climax, your resolution, and then your falling action. And the advantage you get there is you can more easily delineate and say, okay, which parts do I want to stretch and compress? Whereas a 3 act structure, you're pretty much doing 33%, 33%, 33%. Or I guess like in modern movies, it's like 40%, 40%, 20%, right? The ending's always kind of abbreviated in some ways. With a 5 act structure, because it's an odd number, you get this great flexibility of being able to compress different parts of it to suit your story. So in the Guardians example, that introduction is quite trimmed, and the progressive complication is quite long until you get into the realization of the climax and resolution. And it sort of layers down a bit nicer than 3 acts as well. Because you could imagine that on a scene level, you've got an inciting incident, a progressive complication, you kind of get towards your climax and your resolution, then your falling action. That exists in your scene, which then goes up to your act level. Or within your act, you have that 5 act, and then above that, you have your 5 acts. So it kind of telescopes down nicely, whereas 3 acts is a bit more like, I don't know, in my opinion, it's less of a useful framework in these discussions, because I think you lose a lot of the nuance of what Hollywood like is actually doing these days, which is, I guess adhering to those 5 acts that Snyder kind of laid out, in the early 2000s.
I remember I was watching Guardians one time, and like these days I like to look at like the time, like where I'm at in the movie, just to like see what kind of structure it has. Mm-hmm. And with Guardians, the low point is like almost exactly 2/3 of the way through the movie, which I thought was fucking really interesting. So I think I haven't actually read like Sean Coyne or Save the Cat, but I have read like Robert McKee, and he's a big proponent of the traditional 3 act structure. So I don't know. I think James Gunn, there's something there about him using the traditional 3 act structure, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's less about what they actually use. It's more about how you want to read and break down the text, right? Because I could sit down all day and say, okay, well, my books use 5 acts, but you can break that down and be like, actually, I want to look at the 18 beats, or I want to do the 3 acts. Like, I think these are tools we bring to bear to analyze text rather than assuming to interpret the way it was constructed. Unless you're talking about people that ascribe to those things like gospel, right? Like if you go and you find someone from the StoryGrid University that Sean Coyne has, and they've written a book based on a template, like that's where it's super obvious they're doing it. For me, they're more about tools to which, to bring to bear to understand a story. And by now, I imagine you've spent too much time around me, Pat. So you're probably like, yeah, there's like 10 different ways you can read it, and like everything is up for interpretation.
We're all about death of the author here, baby.
Kill him. Get some knives out, baby.
Get that out of here.
Get out of here. Take your authors. Get them out of here.
I wonder, you were talking about the prequel versus the introduction. And I really wonder what would it have been like. How would the story have worked if instead of having that prequel at all, we instead did that later in the movie as a flashback? Like, we still had kind of that same information. We still meet his mother. We still know that childhood trauma. And we still have where this Walkman came from and like where this tape came from. But if the very first scene in the movie was him dancing through the temple, listening to his Walkman, I wonder, because I mean, that's basically Indiana Jones, right? It is. It's really obviously mimicking that, even to the point that he's like breaking through, trying to get this relic that we don't understand. I wonder what it would have been like. Is there more mystery this way? Is there just, how in the world did this guy who's obviously in space get this music from Earth that is classic rock? Like, I don't know. What would that have done?
I think two things. You're right. It would add a layer of mystery, but it would also make Peter's petulance a lot harder to swallow as an audience member. One of the things that saves Peter from being a Chris Pratt type a lot of the time, like we view him with the level of nuance, is that his attachment to this music and this lifestyle is him. We know that there's this emotional resonance with his mother, right? Like we understand the motivation behind the activity he's undertaking in listening to the music, right? It's him preserving that memory. I think if you took that away, you're right, you would have the mystery of like, how the fuck does he have that music? But also you'd be like, wow, this guy's really fucking annoying. Because he's not like a pleasant dude to spend time with, right? Like, I think that would be the outcome is it would be much harder to empathize with him in those moments when he is being petulant. And I think sometimes it might have that Marvel problem of, you know, it would be like a quirky character trait that this guy is like really like obsessed with this mixtape, this Walkman. Why is he going after the Walk? He's so upset that the Walkman's taken away, which isn't the tone they're going for. The tone they're going for is that Peter is unable to express his emotions, so he's lashing out in anger when it gets taken away, or he's frustrated. He's exerting his masculinity in order to defend or, you know, reclaim that tape, if you will. But that's a really interesting thought, and that's kind of why I think it works. Is it seeds enough of, it gives him just enough nuance for the leading man for this story that we swallow a lot of the behaviors that we would otherwise find quite annoying. You know, just think about the way that like Iron Man sometimes comes across in his movies, where you're like, yeah, I get it. Like, we get it. You're rich and you're a dick. I get it. Without the nuance, we'd have a similar view of Iron Man, I think.
It's structured so well, this prelude with the opening on him on that planet, because those two scenes back to back are like inverses of each other. They're like two sides of a coin. So, and David, I like sent you an article that is way fucking back, but you know, it's the if I had to sort of describe the meaning of Guardians in one word, it would be escape, right? And so in the first scene, it is Peter escaping into his music, into his art, to avoid this harsh reality, and then and so we start with the art and then go into the harsh reality. And that's what it seems like it's going to be, you know, like this sort of, that's sci-fi that's kind of self-serious. And then you get to the opening scene and it's like this moody, like, you know, he's on this barren desert planet. He's scanning, you know, what looks like used to be this thriving civilization that's now just, you know, gone. And then he puts on his Walkman and, you know, clicks it on and Come and Get Your Love starts playing. And it's just complete flip of the tone. And yeah, it's just like the complete opposite of what the prelude was happening in the prelude. And like,
that's really interesting too, because it's also visually the complete opposite too, right? Where in the kind of prelude, you've got these close shots. It's a lot of warm lighting. It's very familiar architecture. Then, you know, we have Peter's mother reaching out, and then we go to our introduction, and it's obviously this blasted kind of landscape, this crumbling civilization, blues, you know, cool autumn colors. And then we get through into the area where he's trying to, you know, obtain the Power Stone, and it's Peter that's reaching out and he's taking something. And the reversal of that imagery is interesting to me, because when someone's offering you and saying, I need you, Peter's response is, I'm going to take what I need, but not from you. It's him declaring his self-sufficiency from reliance on that parental figure, or from Earth, or from past, or his past, or whatever, as you say, because he's trying to escape it. It's not that he's taking it for a reason. He's taking it to avoid being present in the other stuff that we just saw. It's like classic escapism, avoidance behavior. Somewhere a fucking therapist is hearing this and having a field day. Yeah, that is a really interesting thought, actually. There are interesting mirrors of each other.
I really like the idea that Pat brought up of kind of the dissonance, the unexpectedness of the soundtrack coming in when it does. And I know this is something that is done in film, and I cannot think of any other examples right now. So if you can think of something, please tell me. But where you have either a really, really dark, depressing scene and a really, really happy song plays, or you have what would seem to be a very happy, very normal everyday life scene, and you have very somber music in the background to kind of show you that there's something else going on here, trying to twist it. And it, at least in the instance that it was done here, it's supposed to let us know as the audience, we don't have to take this too seriously. Like, this is supposed to be a little bit more lighthearted, like he's dancing, he's singing, that it is like a great, fun, happy song, because we just went through something really traumatic with the death of his mother, and they're trying to bring us back out of that and let us have a good time again. So I don't know. Can you think of anything?
And that actually may be, well, skipping the question, but that may be why they didn't put that prologue as a flashback anywhere else in the film, because that couldn't have gone during an action scene, so it would have had to gone during a downtime, which would probably have been after they lost some battle or something, so they've got a downtime while they're traveling. And then so you don't want to have a negative thing right next to a flashback that has a negative thing, because that's just bringing the audience down way too much. But if you split it up and you have the negative at the beginning, then the positive vibes of him dancing, and then you go back to the negative vibe of him running away and trying to escape from the planet, and then they bounce back to a positive vibe right after that. It seemed very intentional the way they did that.
You're touching on a bit of structural theory there, which is the idea of valence shifts, where scene to scene, the way you create narrative momentum is you go from positive to negative and from negative to positive, and you just repeat that pattern throughout your story. So if your opening scene starts negative like this story does, the next scene needs to end positive. And then the scene after that needs to end negative, and then the scene after that needs to end positive. And what it does is it creates this momentum where you feel like every time something happens, you like it just punches up your story, and it keeps pace and it creates momentum. But to the question, another movie I can think of that does this quite well and to a similar effect is something like 500 Days of Summer, which is in my opinion one of the best movies of all time. That movie executes and does reversals and uses music in a very similar way, where there'll be a scene that our protagonist thinks is positive and there'll be positive music playing. But as we watch it, we can see that it's actually like something tremendously negative. And the irony is something that we're allowed to participate in, but the character is not. And it does this brilliant fucking tonal thing with the story where you end up empathizing so much with the protagonist, who is kind of a dick, because you can see how he got to the end point he's in, and you can follow along his thought process because the music is the vehicle by which they convey his emotional state. Also, Spider-Man 2, right? The famous like raindrops are falling on my head scene where Peter's given up the fucking suit and he's over the fucking moon. Yeah. And we know as the audience member, this is bad news, guys. Like we're watching it being like, oh, Peter, mate, you're out of your goddamn mind. This is not good for you. Like, he finally has his well-being back, but we can see that it's going to be short-lived. That's another good example, I think.
Man, I haven't heard a Spider-Man 2 reference in a little while. I'm not going to lie, that one took me by surprise.
It's all I think about.
Keeps me up at night, man. That bite of the hot dog where he like devours the whole thing.
The whole thing in like one bite. What's that about?
Yeah. That's inhuman.
Oh, you don't do that? That's not how you eat hot dogs?
Little glasses? No,
Can't say
not normally. No. I haven't had a hot dog in ages. Damn, now I'm hungry. I think I don't know, it's just interesting to me that like one of the most useful exercises in talking about this stuff is what would happen if I removed an element, right? And which is what we're doing before. It's like, if you took that away, what would happen? That usually helps illuminate why something is present. I think what's interesting about Guardians is by the end of the story, there's like a lot going on. You have 5 kind of core characters. I know one of them's a fucking tree that can't talk, so don't at me. It's still a character. It's still Vin Diesel doing his good stuff on stage. But you have like essentially 5 characters, 4 of them voiced, 3 of them with actual, 2 of them with actual characterizations in this narrative. Well, I guess 3. I'll count Rocket. Like Rocket, Gamora, and Peter. Drax gets more in the following movie. But essentially what you've got is, in this introduction, very clearly setting out the stakes and the emotional arc of our protagonist, or our kind of leading man at the very least. And then everybody else kind of folds into that. Gamora's journey is kind of like the inverse of Peter's in some ways, where she's been shackled to a father, like a parental figure she never asked for, whereas Peter was abandoned by a parental figure he never knew could leave. Her journey to maturity is in accepting that, she's been kind of brainwashed and needs to kind of work through a lot of that trauma. And Peter needs to work through the trauma and undo his own brainwashing, of this avoidance mechanism. And so even though, and obviously, Rocket has this whole thing going on, but even though it's quite a simple setup, like Pat was kind of saying before, it just does a lot of very simple reversals that make it very easy to understand what's going on and place these characters on a spectrum in our heads as things are happening. It's one of the easiest things to do as a writer when you're putting something together, is if you think to yourself, well, how do I highlight this aspect of a character? The way you do that is by contrast, and the best contrast is the opposite of that. Okay, how do we show that Harry Potter is a hero? We have a fucking Hitler wizard, okay? Like a Snake Man. Like it, you know. So that example is quite hacky. If you think about it for too long, but you can do it a lot more subtle. Like, you know, Baby Driver, you have Baby, and then you have, you know, his foil, which is Kevin Spacey's character, and then, you know, you have like John Hamm's character, and then who's the guy that plays Electro? Why is that how I remember? Jamie Foxx. You have Jamie Foxx's character, the foil to
Spider-Man.
Spider-Man. Yeah, no, right.
Jesus Christ.
Two.
I'm sorry, guys. I was the 2 for 2. Yeah, but I don't know. Creating contrast, creating meaningful thematic contrast is a really useful way to highlight different aspects of characters. And then as they shift and move around spectrums, those contrasts highlight, you know, their changes and growth. You know, Peter, chief of which is when he gives that great speech where he's like, we're the guardians of the freaking galaxy. And then Rocket's like, I guess I'll stand up if we're all standing up like a bunch of fucking jerks. And it's great because it is Peter coming together and realizing he needs to be the leader, but it's also undercut by the fact that it's still fucking silly. And then Cherry Bomb plays, and I enjoyed the rest of the movie and don't think about this stuff. And that's what it does really well. Because it sets that stuff up so well, when that stuff happens, you're not thinking, oh, look, Peter's arc is completing. You're like, oh my god, how are they going to stop this dude with the giant hammer? Holy shit, how's Peter going to distract him? He's got no guns left. And then Peter starts dancing. You're so in it because the setup is so eloquent. It does the thing that Rye always talks about, which is it means that you don't clock it as unusual. It just passes through the filter and you accept it, and it feels complete and cohesive. And yeah, there are some things I would adjust if I were to rewrite or punch up this script when it comes to this introduction. But I think serving the movie it's in, and serving the kind of 2 films we've had so far, I think it's just a really eloquent way to begin this piece. And I think it's proof that like you can do a silly movie that still has great narrative coherence, and still kind of delivers on great setup and payoff. Between James Gunn and Guy Ritchie, like there are still people out there doing this stuff really well. And it's just nice to have an opportunity to try and break it down and celebrate it a bit.
I don't know anything about the source material, but I think something that really amazed all of us when it came to this movie was the fact that they were able to take something that's relatively, compared to the rest of the Marvel Universe, relatively unknown. I don't actually know anyone in all of my nerd friends who has read a single one of these comic books before this movie came out. I know those people exist. I just don't know them. So here we have kind of a ragtag team of strange space people, including a tree and a raccoon. And this could have been a very, very difficult movie to make. But they did it, and they did it very, very, very well. So just kind of seeing the beats and how they did it, which is really why I'm glad that you chose this movie, because it's a really great example of if you follow the form, if you talk about characters, if you understand why the main character has this trauma, why he's going through these different steps, it kind of doesn't matter where he is. It doesn't matter that he's in space. It doesn't matter that he got stolen and went over to here. It doesn't matter that he has rocket boots. It just doesn't. You could replace the exact same beats and the exact same story types and have him steal something else and put it in normal everyday Earth in the 20s, and the story just still works.
Oh, you could put it in modern day America and have the main character be a getaway driver, right? Baby Driver and this have exactly the same narrative structure and almost to a T the same leading protagonist.
Yeah. This is really interesting. I had no idea that so much of the rest of the story was affected by the trauma that he experienced from having his mother die, and as you pointed out, so many of the aspects of his character, so many of the other plot points in the film can be attributed back to that introduction and what we saw there. But we're about up with our group discussion time. If anyone has anything to wrap up real quick, we'll take a break.
I was just going to say, like, what a great dynamic that is, where in this Buck Rogers space fantasy, the human guy is the most vibrant compared to the, solemn Gamora, the angry Drax, the sarcastic Rocket. Peter is this kind, sincere, gentle kind of guy.
It's interesting you point that out. Is like they actually literally were different personalities represented. Each one was a specific. There was a cartoon that came out not long ago that was like that, like in the kid's head or whatever.
Inside Out.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was like, what's that fucking movie called?
I love how they do that. I really do. Like who is piloting your brain? Is it anger? Is it sadness?
That's very much what this feels like. It's Drax is anger.
And you got a lot of angry people though. Like Rocket's really angry,
but he's more really sarcastic and
everyone's pretty angry. Yeah, Nebula's pretty angry.
But you're right. There's a lot of sadness, but they just. they stuff all of that sadness deep down where it can't hurt them, and they use anger instead. A lot of the places, but you do have what's her name, who can put people to sleep with her antenna, and
Mantis?
yeah, and she uses a completely different range of emotions that are probably more related to sadness and quietness.
Okay, well,
That
on that note, because we're going to talk about Guardians for another hour if we let it. So let's take a quick ad break, and then we'll come back and go on to Pat's section. Sound good?
Is that a question?
Sweet.
Or a statement?
sounds good. Was that that was a question or a statement?
Yeah.
Pat section.
Yeah, let's call it since I didn't scroll down on my notes, so just call it a definitive statement.
All right, there we go.
So we are back, and Pat, go for it.
Okay. So the film I chose to analyze is Blade Runner 2049.
Yes, Pat. Yes,
Hell
Pat.
yes.
Hell yeah.
Mitchie and I have actually already covered this on our podcast, and we recently did a retrospective where I talked about this film again. And then here I am talking about it again because I could probably talk about this film until I die.
I feel like every time we catch up, Pat, we end up talking about this fucking movie.
I feel like we do, yeah.
Yeah.
So the scene opens with sort of like lines of exposition. And I have it here. So replicants are bioengineered humans designed by Tyrell Corporation for use off-world. Their enhanced strength made them ideal slave labor. After a series of violent rebellions, their manufacture became prohibited and Tyrell Corp went bankrupt. The collapse of ecosystems in the mid-2020s led to the rise of industrialist Neander Wallace, whose mastery of synthetic farming averted famine. Wallace acquired the remains of Tyrell Corp and created a new line of replicants who obey. Many older model replicants, Nexus 8s with open-ended lifespans, survived. They are hunted down and retired. Those that hunt them still go by the name Blade Runner. Gives me chills every time.
So good.
Yeah,
And the Blade Runner's in red too. Oh,
yeah, the replicants in the first word and the last word are both
so
in red.
good.
Yeah. And then we open on an eye opening, which is the same opening as the first Blade Runner film. And like, the eye, very versatile metaphor for a lot of things. And then we see like agriculture fields, like sort of expanding into the horizon and a police car going through them. And then inside we meet our protagonist, Officer K. He arrives at a farm where the character Sapper Morton is farming his little like protein grubs or whatever. He goes back inside. Kay is waiting for him. They talk a bit, and after a while, it's clear that Kay is there to retire Sapper, because Sapper is one of the Nexus 8s that ran away. Sapper and Kay get into it. After some tussling, Kay incapacitates Sapper and then kills him. And he takes his eye out and then scans it. And yeah, that's pretty much it. So I just want to start by talking about how this film sets up the tone. Firstly, this intro exposition scene is just like a brilliant tone setter. The ethereal music in time with each new line of information given has this dystopian storybook feel to it, which I feel like is really like the crux of the vibe of this movie. So as this film relies heavily on its predecessor, this piece of information that Tyrell Corp went bankrupt then was more or less taken over immediately by Neander Wallace, whose replicants were essentially much less autonomous, is a scary primer to this movie because it establishes this oppressive and hopeless feel of the world of this movie, which is the trademark of Blade Runner and just more generally the cyberpunk genre. Again, I think the context from the first film is ideal for this opening sequence to be effective. You get these giant fields in a washed out light. It heavily contrasts with the first film in terms of lights because there was never any sunlight in the first film. We never even saw the city in the daytime. And plus this is out of the city where agriculture is grown. So if you had any questions about like the world building, this gives you some more answers. And since playing Cyberpunk 2077, a lot of my thoughts about the cyberpunk genre have been reevaluated. I always equated the cyberpunk genre with Blade Runner because I thought it just nailed every aspect of it to a T. So to this point, 2077 borrows a lot of things from Blade Runner, like the neon signs, the brutalism architecture, the rampant sexuality in the culture. but something about seeing Night City, which is the city in the game, something about seeing that city in the daytime with harsh sunlight made me realize that Blade Runner has this unique mystical quality about it. It's always raining. There's a tremendous amount of fog everywhere. Even in the day, it's always overcast. And then this is from the next sequence, you get a look at the city, and there must be like 1 billion people just in California because the buildings are impossibly big. And throughout the movie as well, the music and sound design are just major factors in this mystical element. The ethereal music I mentioned, plus like there's this throat singing whenever you see like Neander Wallace in play. Even in this just first opening sequence, you get sort of tastes of that, and it just primes you for like this sort of mythic story. And so in the house, the juxtaposition of the mostly silent scene with Sapper and Kay talking with the sudden outburst of violence is really jarring. And it's such unflattering violence too. Sapper just repeatedly smashing Kay into the wall, and then they're on the ground, they're tussling, and then Kay is just punching Sapper in the head over and over. It's not what we're used to seeing in sci-fi. Traditionally, if sci-fi does have action, it's the more Hollywood thing of punch, take a punch, punch back, then move on. And it always feels inconsequential. Whereas in this scene, there's an intent with every move. Sapper tries to go for the kill first. Then when he can't move his arm because Kay is blocking it, he tries to just brute force it, by smashing him into the wall. Whereas Kay is trying to incapacitate him without killing him immediately because he has to scan his retina first. And so he punches his throat. He punches his throat and knocks the wind out of him. And what this always said to me was that this ain't your escapist space fantasy like Guardians of the Galaxy. This is the real shit.
Yeah. This that hard shit.
Yeah. It's that hard sci-fi. Not like in terms of realism. I mean like hardcore sci-fi. And then in terms of character introductions, I think this is the most interesting on a rewatch once you have all the info about what is actually going on here. But I also think this works just even if you don't have that. I just think that because I've just seen this so many times. But Officer K, being a replicant himself, is genuinely sympathetic to Sapper Morton. He's trying to be polite and have a connection with this man who he knows he has to kill, and he's trying to make it as painless as possible. The reality is that he knows this will go down in a fight, yet he doesn't want to just shoot Sapper and cheese it, for lack of a better word. He puts his gun down on the table, and he doesn't initiate the fight, and we learn that he's honorable. As I said, even on first-time viewing with zero context, the fact that Kay is being polite to Sapper, to the man he kills not 5 minutes after, you get this sense. You get a sense of his character. There's a reluctance there. Sapper's on the ground, and Kay's like, "Please don't get up." And I hope this doesn't sound insensitive, but I think Kay's characterization is meant to evoke something akin to him being on the autism spectrum, right? As if he has trouble connecting with people. And I think this makes him like super sympathetic. There's a kindness that is palpable in his character, which gets explored later on with Joy as well. Overall, I think this opening scene is great, but it's not so amazing that it stands apart from the rest of the film. That's not a criticism of the scene, that's a praise for the movie as a whole. Each scene is just filled to the brim with characterization, world building, and philosophy. And it's a shame that this isn't the standard model for big budget films.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Damn. That's a good point. Interesting you touched on the idea of like the homogenization at the heart of cyberpunk, because one of the things that makes cyberpunk is that like everyone has agreed to this like completely homogenized version of society where like, it's like you get all the like everything kind of looks the same and feels the same, and it becomes suffocating. Where it's like, all the food is the same. Okay, you can only really get like kind of bland noodles in Blade Runner. Like it's always raining. There's no contrast ever. And so when you do have moments of contrast, it really calls your attention to it. And like you said in the house, right? That moment where it calls attention to the contrast is the peace and then the violence.
Yeah.
And this movie seems to be pretty naturally obsessed with the idea of what does contrast look like in a cyberpunk setting where the tone is so coherent and so subsuming that it's almost like Like watching this movie feels like being transported to a place where nobody ever smiles ever, because there's nothing to really smile about. And even the happiness you do have is probably a lie. Like, you know, you get the joy stuff when we find out, you know, Joe is the moniker that, you know, it's, you know, like all of that stuff is like so cooked into the stuff at play here. It's crazy to me how much of that they managed to sneak into this introduction without you even noticing.
Yeah. And, you know, there is this like kind of emphasis on what is real too, immediately right off the bat. Before he kills Sapper, he's like, you're happy scraping the shit, and then he goes, because you've never seen a miracle. Yeah. But yeah, again, like the sound design is just such a crucial element to this. The silence contrasted with like just like noise in general, like, you know, diegetic noise, like the noise pollution of the city, with like the really just like bassy like throat singing and stuff. And then you get moments like when he's out in the desert and it's just like pretty much silent. You know, you hear like wind, and yeah, like it's just, Blade Runner is just full of that kind of stuff. And I don't know, it really lends to that like mythic quality, I feel.
It's playing this really interesting game where it's trying to make you seem like you're in another world or in the future, while at the same time kind of feeling a little bit like just Los Angeles. And it's trying to keep it similar enough that it feels like this isn't too far away. That this is a place where we could find ourselves if just a few things were different. But at the same time, not trying to force it so much that we're looking for every detail to be fine. Like it's okay with fogging out the edges so that we can just concentrate on what we need to concentrate on.
Yeah. This kind of, before we hit record, this goes to kind of what I was saying about when you approach remaking something. So I've been deep in Demon Souls at the moment, and one of the things that does very well as a piece of intellectual property is exactly what you're describing, which is it feels very familiar to the original product or to what we're familiar with, but it changes just enough that you don't pay attention to the edges of the shape of the thing, and instead you just enjoy being in the thing, and you don't sort of worry about where those edges are because they're fogged out just enough that you can suspend your disbelief. I think Blade Runner does a really good job of that, because it seems to understand that the thing about the original movie that was interesting was not the replicants. It was the concept of humanity and the idea of what it means to be human. And this film opens with the statement about that, like the actual text, and then it opens with the statement, which is the action and the violence that Kay is doing to these people who ostensibly, as far as we can tell, have free will. You know, he's enforcing the will of the oppressors, but he's rebelling in small ways in that opening scene, and it sets his character up really well, where it's like Pat said, you know, it's not that he is saying I won't kill. It's that he's like, I don't fucking want to do this, man. Like, don't get up. There's a reluctance to violence that seems at odds with the world, and by definition colors itself as honor through that contrast. And that's a really difficult thing indeed to pull off. Like, you know so much about Kay immediately in that opening sequence without he says like maybe 10 words the whole time. And I know so much about the kind of person he is, the way he's going to act, the way he's behaving, the fact that he more readily empathizes with a replicant than he seems to be able to with humans. Like, there's so much that you learn so quickly in such a rapid sequence with so little dialogue. And that's what I think is so insane about the way this movie is executed, is how much information is conveyed to you, but it never feels like cognitive overload. It doesn't feel like a busy movie in the same way that other sci-fi can. You know, like Jupiter's Legacy or whatever Jupiter Ascending, whatever that film is. Yeah, like that is like noisy sci-fi with a lot of like stuff going on. And Blade Runner has a lot of things in it, but it never feels, the visuals feel clear and deliberate, and possibly it's just Villeneuve being a genius at exactly what he does, but you know, picking different color ranges to adequately reflect the scene that you're in. That introduction is so brilliant, where it's this gray washed out and he gets back into the city, and then it's this simulacrum of life, right? It's like blues and lights and noise and shit pretending to be substance, when, you know, this guy had genuine peace and quiet, and we had to rob him of that in order to continue this thing we call progress. The symmetry is just so beautiful.
That's why I've been able to rewatch this film so many times and keep getting new things out of it. It's because I think this film is like the film that has the most visual storytelling I've ever seen. Like a bit later on in Kate's apartment, like I noticed this time that even though his apartment is meant to have like this sort of like clean modern interior look to it, like the walls are just like kind of like really dirty, but not very noticeably so. There's just, and that's what you can do with like $150 million, man. You can just make every shot just like super detailed and have so much like text about it, like so much information given.
Specificity.
Yeah.
And that's specificity is at the heart of really good stories.
You brought up something that has kind of gotten me to thinking. When you were mentioning the fight scene that kind of opens up the movie, there's two characters, and as you said, it's a really brutal fight. We know up front this is not a happy, fun-loving movie. Like, we know that this is going to be very gritty. Like, that's the tone that we're going for. And it immediately made me think of another movie that does this, Casino Royale, when they rebooted the James Bond franchise. Almost first thing, you have him slamming a guy's head down into a bathroom sink. And, like, bathroom fights are always the grossest fights. They just are. They are designed for that, to let you know this is not fun. This is really happening. He's going to kill somebody and it's not going to be pretty. And I never really considered opening a movie with a really brutal one-on-one fight scene to be a trope until I came up with these two examples. And now I'm thinking that this is actually something that probably other movies that I haven't thought of yet do to introduce not only the tone, but how the character is going to do his job, whether or not he shows regret or not, whether or not he has a choice to fight or not to fight, how the fight ends, his prowess as a fighter. There's a lot of stuff you can get in here while still kind of showing the tone. I guess it's the difference between having like a Batman that just strings up a bad guy with a little note that says, "Here, Commissioner Gordon," and a Batman that is like cutting people with his batarang. It's I can't think of any other examples off the top of my head for another movie that does this.
I mean, I could think of like 10, but Daredevil is a TV show. Opens after you get your prologue, you get Matt Murdock beating on some fools. It's a pretty common technique because what it does, and I want to expand this not from violence, but to be the central activity the film is focused on, because I think that's where you can get really good scope on this, is not necessarily that it opens with a fight scene, but that it opens with a focus on the scope of the activity of the film. What I mean by that is if you're watching a movie about, say, lawyers, the thing that you'll often open with is you'll be medias res in a courtroom and they'll be doing lawyering and you'll see how good at lawyering our lawyer is. If it's a movie about, hunting down replicants, you open with how good is Kay at hunting down replicants. If it's a story about relationships, we open with, how good is this person at, relationships or emotional vulnerability. I think it's just interesting. The Matrix is about suspending your belief and or suspending your perception and believing. And the first thing we open with is understanding that Neo, believes beyond the scope of the rules of society. And, the way that you open the story and the activity that you show us doing is definitely like a technique. Yeah, a trope. I don't know what you want to call it, but yeah, it is interesting in retrospect that a lot of films in the action genre do this, because obviously action is the primary thing that happens. I think Casino Royale is a fantastic example.
To quote you on our podcast, this ain't your granddaddy's James Bond.
This ain't your granddaddy's James shit. Bond, baby. That's the first time I've been quoted in the room with someone, but I'll take it. Yeah, it isn't. And it's communicating a really specific message to the viewer. Same with 2049. Same with a lot of movies that feel like Baby Driver is another good example I keep bringing up. That tells you immediately the kind of movie this is going to be from the second that the music starts playing. Same with Guardians. It does seem to me that if you're going to construct a meaningful action film, one of the things you do is you start with meaningful action of some description. You don't notice it when it's present, but you notice its absence when a movie starts really flaccidly, I think, or doesn't have this kind of tone setting. And I would argue that, like the first Blade Runner doesn't have this.
Well, I think the first Blade Runner is a much more pensive film. And so the opening scene is him looking through the list of the replicants he has to hunt down, and it's like the flicker of this like cassette technology, and detectives like smoking, and Harrison Ford's bassy voice and stuff like that. So yeah, in terms of that film, it's not the same for sure, but I think it sets the tone pretty well.
That's one thing that I wanted to make sure that I emphasize now, because that's really important when it gets into talking about the show that I want to cover, because everything that we're talking about is immediately with this introduction, understanding the world, understanding the characters, at least understanding some aspect of their personality, their motivation, what they're about from the very beginning moving forward. And that has been a big part of both of your presentations so far, is that in the introduction for these films, we have to know those things. We have to know the world. We got to know the characters. We have to have some idea of the plot. And I expect for Star Wars as well, that's going to be something that Eric talks about, that and that's for my show. I feel one spot where it completely broke down, whereas these are all great comparisons for how you do those things properly. But we'll get to that in a sec. One thing that I thought was really interesting when you were talking about the initial scene where the one guy is sitting there kind of being polite and relatively quiet, even though he knows he's about to kill someone. It immediately reminded me of the scene from Inglourious Bastards, where the German dude is being super nice and polite and smiling and drinking tea right before he shoots up a bunch of people. I don't know why that comparison immediately jumped into my head, but it was really interesting thinking about like the tonal quality of the two different scenes, even though they were structurally the same thing, of one guy who was being mostly polite, who was trying to figure out information right before he was going to kill someone, but they both had completely different feelings to each scene.
It's funny you bring that up, because I think it speaks to contrast again. Another good example of that, I've got two off the top of the dome, is in X-Men First Class, where you've got Magneto who goes into the bar with the ex-Nazi soldiers, and he's really polite and he's drinking a beer with them, and then he brutally murders them.
Great scene.
Another really like easy example that is the whole way through is in Fargo, both the TV show and the movie. Lorne Malvo's character, who is this polite, philosophical, plotting man who is capable of committing great and heinous acts of violence when the need arises or when he desires to. And I think it speaks to something in the human condition where we've been told by society that if you walk a particular way and you dress a particular way and you treat others with a particular respect, if we all just do that and we've kind of agreed to what we call society. Okay, this thing underpins us. We all behave in ways that exist within a range that we deem to be acceptable. The idea that someone could mask this festering capability for doing violence behind the thing that we all do every day is what makes it confronting and scary and exciting. It's why we love Hannibal Lecter, because he's this eloquent, charismatic, classy individual who fucking eats people, man.
If you're gonna be a cannibal, be classy with it. Pinky up.
That's it. Yeah. Well, it's fucking scary. Like, it's scary that these monsters masquerade as businessmen in suits. Obviously, Wall Street's full of criminals, but think of American Psycho. Like, this stuff's always been in our consciousness. I think it's the contrast of polite society with the lizard brain violence that we all seem to be capable of if push comes to shove.
A cool evolution of this, I think, is like John Wick, maybe. Yes. You look at Keanu Reeves and you're like, he's no Jason Statham or anything, but then you see him fucking mow down 30 dudes with like frightening efficiency, and you're like, holy shit! Like, I did not expect that.
It's a natural endpoint of that idea. Yeah.
I have. Do we have time for my question? Yes, we do. My question is, it's two parts. Does Blade Runner 2049 depend on the viewer already seeing Blade Runner for it to make sense? And just really the opening. Does the opening depend on somebody seeing Blade Runner for it to make sense? And if it does, is that a flaw, or can it still be great?
If you were like a really savvy like viewer and you got, you really took in all the information in that opening title screen, and then you knew that K was a Blade Runner. He was hunting this dude down. Like, yeah, I think it could work without any context. But the first time I watched this scene, and I think a lot of other people as well, I was really confused. I was like, well, I don't really know what's going on. I knew what was going on here on like, you know, just like this dude and this other dude are fighting because he needs to kill him. But yeah, it wasn't until I rewatched, you know, the first Blade Runner like a couple years later and then rewatched this one, I really started to appreciate everything that was going on. So I think if I had to give an answer, yes, you do need context. Is that a flaw? I don't know. I don't think so. It's a sequel. You know, you don't just jump into a sequel and expect to and be mad when you don't understand what's going on.
I was the exact same way, and that's kind of what I was wondering was, it had been since, I don't know, probably at least 10 years since I had seen Blade Runner when I went to see 2049, and I felt so lost at first. I caught up because the movie gets you there, you know, and you kind of just forget about the background details. And then it did the exact same thing. Said, I think I'm going to enjoy this more if I just watch Blade Runner again. And then I did. And then it really helped build out that experience for me a little bit more. And on one hand, I think good for them. Good for the filmmakers not trying to water down the story to make it applicable to an everyday audience who has never seen the original work. Instead, they spoke to exactly who they wanted to speak to. Fans of the original, who came back and wanted to see the sequel. And if somebody goes in there and says, I don't understand what's happening, that's their fault. They've got to do their homework beforehand, and they've got to go watch the original movie so they can understand what's going on in the sequel. So I guess I'm saying I like it too.
I love that. Yeah. I love that. Just like, you know, not bothering to have that, you know, 4-quadrant mainstream appeal type of shit. Like, yeah. And I mean, you know, this movie didn't do very well.
That's white men are fucking money, but that's okay because it's good art. And I think we often confuse profitability with merit, particularly in Hollywood.
And it probably could have made more money if they had watered it down more. You know, more mass appeal. You still have Harrison Ford. You still have a great cast. If they had played it a little bit safer, they might have made more money with it. But that's not what they wanted to do.
I mean, they could have made more money if they just had Ryan Gosling be shirtless more.
The shirtless walk.
I would have bought it like 10 times. Yeah, it's fine.
All right, we've run into our time limit. Anyone have anything else before we take another break?
Nope. I just wanted to say that, Pat, I think you're crazy. No.
Mic's off. Can't talk.
Nice.
Die.
Yeah, nice. Bye.
All right, let's take a quick ad break, and then we'll come back and do Eric's section next. Give me a clap.
Pulled out my own earphones. How dare you make me clap?
The audacity.
No, I'm not coordinated.
Sorry, the audacity.
You put us all like, hey.
No, I got it the first time. Cool. I just didn't think that merited a response.
Wow. Hurtful, Pat. Hurtful.
I could what?
You could take Death of the Author quite seriously. Because you know an author and you have knives.
Oh, right. Good one.
Jesus Christ. All right, so Pat's upset with my humor today for some reason.
And we're back. We're going to go next over to Eric for his section on Rogue One.
All right, thank you. Rogue One, a Star Wars story, is a 2016 film directed by Gareth Edwards. In the film continuity of the rest of these Star Wars movies, it is set 1 week before the events of A New Hope, and details how the Death Star plans were stolen and how the rebels won their first victory over the Empire, which is referenced in the opening scroll of A New Hope. It did come out 1 year after The Force Awakens and 1 year before The Last Jedi in the December release that Disney decided to do with all of the Star Wars movies they've done so far. What this did was give us the idea of, all right, we've already seen how they did one new Star Wars movie, but this one isn't quite a Star Wars movie. You know, it falls into this Star Wars stories, like the Solo movie, which I'm never going to mention again because I don't want to get you guys excited.
There's nothing out there.
Breathing is like a physiological action. Like it doesn't.
What? Maybe they're breathing. It's antimatter.
No, that's not. This antimatter isn't. It's the absence of matter.
Dark,
it's just not the opposite.
Dark energy.
Well,
But I'm going to talk about a couple of terms that, just really quickly that I'm going to be using. The first is just archetype, which is a pattern of behavior or a recurring symbol or motif. I use trope as well as to get this idea across. In Jungian psychology, there's this idea of a collective unconscious, kind of an instinctual understanding of certain events and personalities that, if you really believe the idea, is worldwide. So it's one of the reasons that stories in a mythological sense are so similar between cultures and even between time periods. The idea of Cinderella as a story exists in many, many different cultures around the world. Just the idea of, here is a young girl and her mother or her parents are taken away, and it's kind of like a rags to riches story. And it taps into something universally that we can all understand. If an author wants to use these tropes or these archetypes, they are tapping into something shared collectively by all humans. And if you do that, odds are more humans will buy your book or watch your movie. So archetypes are very important from the writing standpoint when you're trying to create a story or whether you're trying to create characters. As I said, an example of this would be the rags to riches storyline, or more broadly, even like comedy or tragedy are archetypes that you can work with, or character archetypes like the trickster, Loki, or the dangerous biker with a heart of gold, or just like the rogue character, whatever it is. These are character tropes, archetypes that we can get to understand and get to know a character very, very quickly, and then see them actually go on their adventures. So, talking about the actual introduction, I'm really going to be looking at this through the lens of the hero's journey or the monomyth, and we've mentioned his name several times, and that's just Joseph Campbell, who is the author and scholar that popularized this theory. He's by no means the only one to talk about it, but he talked about it the most, and his words had the most emphasis when it came to this. So the theory of the monomyth does state that there is a common template that can be applied to all stories if we're trying to figure out how the story is built, especially those important tales of folklore and mythology that take place all over the world. His most important book was called The Hero with 1,000 Faces, and it describes the basic narrative pattern. These are his words. A hero ventures forth from the world of common day into a region of supernatural wonder. Fabulous forces are there encountered, and a decisive victory is won. The hero comes back from this mysterious adventure with the power to bestow boons on his fellow man.
Lord of the Rings.
It's very broad, but in a way it's supposed to be very broad. You're supposed to be able to apply it to lots of different stories to show that this is how the basic story works. I'm not gonna lie, this is contentious. It's not absolutely set in stone. A lot of theorists will actually argue that Joseph Campbell chose the stories to apply to this that he knew were going to fit, and while completely ignoring other stories that don't very well fit the monomyth. But I'm not really trying to argue whether or not this can be applied to every story. I'm trying to argue that it is being applied to the story I'm talking about, which is Rogue One. So it always begins one of two ways. You have two different options, which is the hero's call to action or the unusual birth. And that just kind of depends on where you feel like starting your story. A New Hope starts with the call to action because we don't see Luke as a baby or as a child. We see him as a relative adult who is able to go out and have adventures on his own. So when he is called to action, he is able to respond to that action. However, the first bit of Rogue One, in my opinion, should really be called a prologue, just like everything that David just said with Guardians of the Galaxy, because the main character starts as a kid. The prologue, the beginning section, isn't meant to be seen as part of the general narrative, the real story. Instead, this is supposed to be build up to let us know who this character is, what has she gone through, and why is she who she actually is? What has determined for her to be this character? So, featuring the main character as a child many years before the proper action of the film provides the unusual birth. And movies do this all the time. It happened in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. We saw it in 300, Finding Nemo, Batman, Forrest Gump. It's a very popular thing for us to have a character that is twisted in some way, who has gone through something, and we're going to show them go through this as a child so that we can understand why we have a flawed character now. Otherwise, it just opens up on a flawed character and we don't really know why. From a mythological standpoint, it's also, you got baby Moses floating down the Nile in a basket, and you have Hercules going through everything that he went through. So these are no matter where you are, the idea of a child going through trauma or having an unusual beginning is something that kind of lets us know, signifies, this is the hero. This is the person that we are going to want to be watching for the rest of this movie. The important thing about this is that that section can't really last very long. We don't want to see little Peter Quill actually mourning his mother. We don't want to see little Forrest Gump's sad childhood with his little leg braces for too long. Like, it's too much. We want to see them grow up and learn to play football as fast as they possibly can so that we can get to the actual story of the movie. Otherwise, it's just super boring, to the point that we watch Simba go from a cub to a grown-up lion within a 15-second space in the middle of Hakuna Matata, because that's not important. Like, that's, no matter what Lion King 1.5 wants to tell you, that part is not actually important. Everything up to that point is introduction. So, to get into the actual movie and what is happening, Rogue One, I didn't remember this from watching it in previous times, but it is playing games with the fans left and right. They're just trying to make us think that it's like Star Wars, and then they pull the rug out from under us. It starts with the same blue letters on the screen a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, and then there's several seconds of blank screen where we're wondering if we're going to hear that music. Are we going to hear the John Williams theme? But instead, it starts with an unexpected stinger note, and a distant planet pops up onto the screen. This is actually the exact same trick that they did for the music in the Force Awakens official teaser at the 23-second mark. What it does musically is it gives us the feeling that the story has already begun. Instead of starting with a slow theme that kind of builds and starts low, and then we get a theme that we can actually sing along to, just starting with a stinger, it lets us know that we're just joining in, action has already happened, the stakes are already very high, and we just need to hold on and we need to catch up. Then the camera pans up and shows a gray triangular shape start coming down from the top of the screen, which if you've watched any other Star Wars movie, fans are already thinking, that's some kind of starship. I don't know who it is, I don't know why it is, but it's coming and it's something. But then after it pans down a little bit more, we see these are actually the rings of a planet that they filmed at a very suspicious angle to make it look like a spaceship, which, I don't know, they did it, they were having fun with it. Again, they're just playing games with us. Let's pretend for a second that you are one of those very, very few people in the world that has never seen any Star Wars movies, and you're coming into this just completely blind. The movie is doing something for those people as well. What we are doing for those not fans is you see it open in space looking at a planet. So we know this is probably a science fiction film, but it could still be real life. Is it an Apollo mission? Is it something else? So immediately, as soon as we can, we try to get a spaceship in there to let them know that we are watching a science fiction movie. And we make this, if you're not familiar with Star Wars ship engineering, which lets us know that this is very obviously an evil ship just because of the angles and the design, like we've seen enough Star Wars ships at this time that we know this is not a nice guy ship. The music in the background will let anybody know that this ship is not a good thing. It's very low, it's very ominous, it's slowly building up to something, and there's just one ship by itself is coming in towards this planet. So you're watching this Imperial shuttle fly down to the planet, and we see it fly over a beach, which is nice because Disney really likes playing with the idea of, well, we've never seen this geography in Star Wars before, so here's a Florida beach. Why not? Go for you, Rogue One. And they get into the idea that each movie should have a really big geographic zone, and a lot of this movie takes place on beaches and around bodies of water, especially the ending scene when they're all fighting to try to get the transmission up into space. It's actually little islands that each have their own individual beaches. It's a stylistic choice. Running along that beach because she sees the shuttle coming in is a little girl who is very clearly freaked out, and this is the first human we meet since the movie opens. We then cut to a man watching some surveillance screens and a woman in the same house with him, and the magic of storytelling has the audience inferring that these three people are probably a family. The girl's running, and she's passing by some large metal pillars that look suspiciously familiar to the moisture evaporators on Luke Skywalker's Tatooine farm. Again, they're just kind of trying to get this idea across of, this is a Star Wars movie for people who know how to recognize Star Wars movies. Just these little visual pieces, throwbacks that, this is a very different planet. They're probably not actually moisture farming, but they do mention that he's farming, and they don't mention what he's farming. So maybe he's doing the same thing. Actually, how they introduce the characters and how they show us the relationships between the characters breaks down very, very neatly. The girl runs in and she yells mama, which grants the audience that little rush that we feel when we think we're right about something. Oh, she was obviously the girl's mother the whole time. Then the man calls the girl by the name Jin. Gather your things, it's time. In the story, this lets us know by just about the first line of the movie, something dangerous is coming, but they've been expecting it. They have a plan. Lets us know something about the characters. These are people who plan ahead, very analytical, and they know what they're going to do. Her mom is in getting things together in the kitchen. The camera puts the jug of blue milk dead center in the middle of the screen and then just leaves it there. Like, hey guys, did you see it? Did you see the blue milk? Just in case. Again, just like a nudge towards all of the watchers who can get what the blue milk is and then explain it to everybody else afterwards. The mom makes a phone call, getting our fourth character introduced on the screen, and conveniently enough, she gives us two names at the exact same time by saying, Saw, it's Lyra. It's happening. He's come for us. Now we know the names of all of the characters we have met so far, and we know that the dangerous thing coming is a man, which is probably obvious because this is Star Wars, and he's flying in a shuttle, and men outnumber women in this universe by 3-1, so he's probably a man. But the man calls Jin over, he kneels down, and he lets her know that he's only doing this to protect her. He calls her by Stardust, which is her nickname, and she calls him Papa, further taking out any confusion about this family dynamic. Like, they're really going out of their way with dialogue and just the scenes to make sure that we understand that this is a family, this is a close family, and giving us the names behind it just in case we're not getting it. Then Lyra, the wife mother, calls him Galen, and we have all of the on-screen characters named 2 minutes and 28 seconds into the movie. Now we start getting into the bad guys, and we see after the shuttle lands, there are death troopers all dressed in black. And a general rule for cinema and story is that while it is possible to wear black and not be bad, that's probably not going to be our first assumption. But from Sauron to Darth Vader and the evil queen from Snow White, like, these people wear black. It is possible for a lone character to wear black and not be evil. However, I think it's probably really hard to find a group of characters all wearing matching black armor to not be seen as evil. I tried really hard to think of an example where there are...
Would you accept matching black trench coats?
I mean...
Damn it.
I won't, because then it ruins this. Sorry. All right. So they were like 100% of the time, those people are going to be evil. And that's just the way it's going to be. And the movie has really set this up. You know, of course, this nice little family that we see drinking their blue milk and giving nicknames to their children are running from these people. So they are probably going to be evil. And it helps set up that there is a bad guy here. And we're only 2.5 minutes into it. And it's very ominous. They're not really showing the villain, kind of showing the monster yet. As they pan back and show these death troopers walking in the middle, there's their leader who has this really billowing white cloak, but you don't really get to see his face. They're really keeping it panned back to try to keep him as secretive as possible until the actual altercation happens between him and Galen. So Lyra and Jin, they go hide until Lyra strangely decides to give Jin her necklace so she can promptly abandon her. And that's okay because it serves the narrative structure. And we've done a very important thing. We have a token or a sacred relic in this necklace that is given from mother to daughter that signifies something. We don't know what it signifies. We don't really know at this point why it is important, but it is determined to be so by its placement in the movie and the accompanying mystic words, trust the Force. Even if you know nothing about this, it seems very religious, it seems very mystic, it seems very sacred that she is giving her this necklace, saying to trust in a higher power, and then totally just leaving her and going back to do her thing. In a properly told story, this relic is going to come back further in to help the hero achieve their goals, either through inspiration or more directly as a kind of Chekhov's gun of, did you know that that necklace was the very key that she needed to actually defeat the big bad guy at the very end? Like, that's the way a lot of movies are actually going to do this. Doesn't really happen in this movie like that, but at least in the introduction, we kind of see what is happening thematically. Ben giving Luke his father's lightsaber, Frodo receiving the mithril vest from Bilbo, Harry Potter being given his invisibility cloak. These are all tropes of that idea of like the main character receiving a sacred object, usually from a father figure or a mother figure or just kind of a parent figure in general. And the second archetype established by Lyra leaving Jin is the abandoned, lost, or orphaned child, which we really talked about when we were talking about Guardians of the Galaxy. It helps show who this character is and why they are doing what they're doing. We mentioned Harry Potter as well. That's another example. The Chronicles of Narnia, these kids are being drawn away from their parents to go have adventures without them. James and the Giant Peach. Like, anytime there's an orphan, you're working with this trope. You have to do away with the parent figure to allow for a few things. The child doesn't have a very good support system, so you have built-in tension, but they do have more freedom for hijinks and adventures because they are not disappointing or leaving the parent who is sitting there at home trying to support them. It's much harder to write a story with a hero character where they have a nice, loving parent sitting at home waiting and supporting them as they go off on their adventures. So as Galen Erso is confronted by Imperial Director Orson Krennic, who is our last named character in the introduction and just the source of all of this conflict that we have, wife Lyra pops back up because she feels like she can take them all, I guess. I don't know. They don't prop her up very well in this introduction. I think we are supposed to understand that she's not necessarily weak, but fully unprepared to live life without her husband. That's kind of what they're going for, that in the choice between saving her daughter and like being with her daughter and the potential to save her husband, she chooses her husband, which is kind of jarring for a lot of audiences who see that the mother is always going to go with the kids. That's kind of a more traditional thing. So in a way, it's kind of breaking our expectations that she does go back and try to save her husband at the expense of being able to actually be with her daughter. And of course, Jin sees everything happen because nothing really helps that abandoned child archetype like actually seeing their parent die, and this is a Disney movie, so the mother is not allowed in and just has to die anyway. Dads can stay and play as long as they are emotionally distant. That's fine.
Just like real dads.
Just like real dads. Great. So Jin goes into hiding until she's saved by Saw Gerrera, the dude that we saw talking to Lyra on the screen in the kitchen earlier. Him drawing her out of the little hidey hole and saying we have a long road ahead of us immediately makes us think that he will be her supernatural guide. He will be her Gandalf figure who is going to show her the secrets that she needs to exist in this world. And then, before he even draws her out, the screen cuts, and we're looking at the title screen for Rogue One, and everybody in the audience is thinking, oh, wow, that's right, I forgot, we haven't actually seen this yet, because it's 7 minutes and 45 seconds into the movie, and we haven't actually seen the title of the movie yet. I haven't done a big comparison, but that feels like a really long time
pretty long
to me, as far as introductions go, to just let you know what's going on before you see the title screen. It's just... that took me by surprise. We cut from the words, and we see a woman asleep in the dark, the sound of dripping water, and the unmistakable sound of a jail cell door being opened, because even in space, the jail cell has to sound the exact same way it does in Wild Wild West, because we have to know what we're listening to. And in case the audience doesn't get it, they really hammer us over the head with the fact that she is in prison. We see her cellmate in a bunk. We see poor hygiene conditions. There's a small room. And then an intercom in the background says, check-in security cell block 4227. And then we hear a man scream in pain. And then we pan back to see bars on the door and taking the whole prison cell. And then you see a stormtrooper walk past the door checking on other inmates. So I feel like it's too much, personally. Like, they're really not giving the audience any credit to understand that she is in prison. Instead, it's oh, is she in prison? Oh, she's probably in prison. Oh, she's really probably in prison now. And they just do it like 8 times. I think it's too much. We get it. She's in prison. We just saw little Jin get saved by Saw, though. So we're supposed to think, well, what happened to her? What happened to her mystic leader? It's like losing her mother and father at a very young age has interfered with her decision-making abilities, and somehow she's wound up in prison. How did that happen? But then immediately from that, you have your sweeping orchestral music and asteroids throttling towards the camera, which universally signifies that this is the end of the introduction. We have now gotten into the proper storyline, and we've met all of the characters. We've already seen one die. We've met our hero. We've seen her get scarred as a child. And now that she's grown up, we're ready for our story to actually begin, now that we're already 8 minutes and 45 seconds into the movie. So that's it. That's the introduction to Rogue One. I have a hard time with it because I both love it and think that they tried a little bit too hard and did not necessarily respect the audience with some of their storytelling. Actually having to go through and name all of the characters, having to show the relationships between the characters. I mean, they didn't go as far as saying like, "Dear husband, I will miss you," but
It's pretty fucking close.
They basically did.
It's pretty close.
You know? Yeah, it is. It is. They really hand-fed the audience with all of the information to make sure that we weren't getting confused, to the point that it kind of got annoying to a certain point. Like, I was still into it and I still really liked it, but I felt like they could have pulled some of that back, had a little bit less dialogue, a little bit fewer names, because it kind of doesn't matter at that point in the movie, and just let the scene build itself.
Of course, on one level, it also could be realistic because my nephews are both over at the house, and like they never talk to you without saying your name 5 times in the same sentence.
It's true.
So, like, the idea of Jin calling him Papa really makes a lot of sense to me because, you know, Peter does not talk to you without saying "Daddy, Daddy, Daddy" 5 times.
Over and over and over again.
Yeah.
And
That is
poking
true. Yeah.
I mean, like Darth, I know your channel is a Star Wars one. I don't mean to be disparaging, but like, you know, it is Star Wars at the end of the day. Like, you need to be clear. You need to be very you know, like on the nose to make sure everyone's on the same page. No one's left
Everyone
behind.
needs to
It
get
just
it.
needs to be inclusive. You know, like
It's for everybody.
yeah.
I mean, that's a really good point. One of the questions that I've been asking myself as well is kind of the same question that I asked you earlier. Is this too dependent upon knowledge of the prior movies for it to actually make sense? And I think it would be really, really hard for somebody who has no knowledge of what the Death Star is to actually understand what is going down. I mean, yeah, you get like, bad guy is coming, wants to take dad, mom gets shot. That's pretty obvious. But besides that,
in this movie, do they ever actually define the Death Star as a weapon that can blow up a planet? Or are they assuming the audience already
They
knows?
talk about it when they're talking about the plans. They talk about it as a planet killer, but they don't name it as the Death Star until the very end.
Yeah, they just say the project that you're working on, or the weapon.
Okay, so like, it's an interesting question though, isn't it? Because I don't think there's anyone on who would be consuming this film who doesn't at least know what Star Wars kind of is about. They know it's like space lasers and Darth Vader. Like, even if you haven't seen a Star Wars movie, even my most media illiterate family know what Star Wars is. Like, they have an idea of it. It's kind of in the same way that like everybody knows who Batman and Spider-Man are, like, you know, and Superman. Like, they're
Third reference.
everyone knows who Spider-Man is. I don't know, that's in my brain for some fucking reason. But you know, to the extent that you don't need to re-explain certain aspects of those properties. I don't need to see another Uncle Ben get shot. I don't need to see another Peter Parker get bitten by a spider. I don't need to see, you know, Superman come from Krypton again. We fucking get it, guys. It's fine.
And yet they have to do that in every movie.
It's because Zack Snyder really wanted to do Krypton, and, you know, in his defense, it was pretty fucking sick. So whatever.
A lot of fallacies.
A lot of dicks in space.
Unexpected fallacies. Yeah.
I mean, between him and Dan Harmon, there's a lot of penises on screen at times. But it is interesting to the question of, does this rely too much on contextual knowledge of Star Wars? I think the story by itself still functions. It doesn't. It still has some of the bugbears of its compatriot Solo, where it sort of ends up for the stakes to feel meaningful, it relies on you understanding that the Death Star is a plot crucial element. But the idea of this ragtag group of people going to steal these plans that are going to be bad for the people who live in this world, you know, these plans being developed by this dictatorship, I think that by itself stands alone as a pretty coherent story. It just so happens to be folded into Star Wars. And it feels like at times they use that context of it being Star Wars to punch up the stakes rather than relying on it to as like conveyance for why our characters are invested. Like, we understand that Jyn is being press ganged into being a good guy, and then she reluctantly accepts being a good guy. Like, I don't think the narrative structure or the arc of these characters off the back of that introduction relies on it being Star Wars. To almost its strength at times. I don't know how much I commit to that as a belief though, because it does periodically really fucking lampoon itself and be like, particularly at the end. It gets really egregious by the end. But I think throughout, like, it manages to not go too far, I don't think. I think it could have, you know, if halfway through we saw a fucking lightsaber or something when we met, you know, our Force sensitive dude, if he had a lightsaber, I'd say that would be taken one step too far. But I think it holds itself back enough. I don't know. What do you guys think?
I think, you know, I don't know, it's always an interesting exercise to like wonder, you know, like could this movie in a franchise work on its own? Could it be a coherent story? I think so, but you know, it's interesting that this movie in particular, like the thing that makes it so special is its connection to Star Wars, like how you know, the hole in the Death Star was, you know, this like egregious seemingly plot hole in the episode, you know, in the New Hope, and then in this movie it's like, oh, that was all intentional. And then that's like such, you know, that is a detail that is like super, like, it makes this movie kind of, you know what I mean, like and then because it's also just like a really well coherently crafted story, it's just I don't know, it just works on like a lot of levels, I feel.
It's a retcon, but it's a well done retcon, and I think it makes the fans happy at the end of the day that we finally have an explanation for this very simple question of who left that hole there. Like, why would that be there? Who would design a ship with this kind of flaw? So while I understand that they are doing this as a fan service retcon, I'm cool with it. Like,
it's very eloquent. It's way better than like J.K. Rowling's retcons, where she just makes shit up and is like, "I promise to tell what I meant, guys. Don't check though." Like, it's
your fault because you didn't get it.
One thing I like particularly about the explanation, if I remember correctly, was that it wasn't just the fact that it was there and that you could shoot something into it, but the idea was that shooting something into an exhaust port would never do any critical damage, but he designed the interior of that exhaust port to empty into the reactor, which never would have happened. So it wasn't the fact that it was a port you could shoot into. That was never an issue. What he did was in the inner connectings of how everything worked, which is just another subtle thing to the fans of, you know, we're not explaining away the hole. The hole was never the issue. The interiors were the issue, and we thought about that, and this was the answer.
Can I ask you guys a devil's advocate question? So Batman Begins has a very similar opening structure. We start with young Bruce Wayne seeing Mama and Papa get shot. But then conversely, we then cut to Bruce Wayne in a Chinese prison beating the shit out of some dudes in the mud. Like, that opening, I fucking love that opening sequence. And then he gets thrown in prison, and then he has exactly the same thing happen, which is in prison, someone says, "Look, I have a mission for you." Now, this story does the same thing, but it lingers far longer on the pre-prison stuff and skips the inciting incident that gets that character into that prison. One of the things that Batman Begins does is it conveys to us that Bruce Wayne is not only a force of will to be reckoned with, in that he's willing to take on these 5 or 10 dudes, but also that he's competent and dangerous enough that they throw him in isolation to protect the other people. We don't learn, which is a fucking,
it's a great
awesome
detail,
by the way. I love that movie. And, you know, we also learned a lot about Ra's al Ghul in that context, because we realized that he can infiltrate this prison, you know, seemingly apropos of no resistance. What's curious to me about Rogue One is that we don't learn anything about Jyn as an adult just by placing her in that prison. The only way we learn about her as an adult is her reacting to the call to adventure when the good guys are like, listen, we need your bloody help, mate. And so it's just interesting contrasts in my mind of the way to approach two of those different openings that are very similarly structured in similarly structured action movies. It's just curious to me.
It is interesting because we are not necessarily shown that Jin is a very competent hero. She's not incompetent by any means, but we're not seeing, oh, she's a fantastic fighter. Oh, she's a fantastic pilot. Oh, she's brilliant like her father. If anything, she is a hero because of who her father is, because of the relationship that she does have to her father, which is hard. That is hard, especially for a movie that features a female hero.
I will backtrack one of those statements because I analyzed her character a bit in the misogyny video. Saw Gerrera actually says at one point, you were the fiercest warrior I ever trained, or best soldier I ever trained, something like that. And actually, right before she gets captured by Saw Gerrera's gang, she's inside an armored transport, and like she barehanded takes down like 3 guards and then escapes, and she's only knocked down by the robot. So we actually see evidence of her being a good fighter before the scene where Saw Gerrera says, you are the best fighter I ever trained. So that's, the establishing visually and then confirming it with the dialogue that really placed her experience level, like Raizo is talking about. It showed us beforehand, before it confirmed it, and it made it so much more believable, because it was like we talk about Rey, she's fighting out of nowhere, and you have to assume that she learned that as part of her survival skills or whatever, but we have no proof.
We do not see it happen. Yeah. No, that is a very good point, and I'm glad you said that, because it does kind of reverse the way that I had been thinking about it. The angle that I was trying to take with it was that instead of perhaps, as the movie goes along, instead of the traditional hero's journey where it is really all focused on her and her abilities, that it's more focused on her relationship and her ability to get different disparate groups to work together and to form a team that can then achieve its goal. And by no means is she spearheading this operation. Like, she's not, it's the budding rebellion that's the brains of the plan, but she's the crux of it. She is by far the person who all of the other people kind of see as the figure to look to as inspiration.
And one of the bigger problems with this entire story for me is her character, because what we have to assume from the introduction is that her entire purpose in life is going to be reuniting with her father.
Yeah.
But we don't really know what she wants throughout the entire rest of the film. She eventually sees her father gets killed in front of her, and it's not like she's doing the rest of this out of revenge. The entire second half of the movie is like, what does she want? You never could really tell. And you had the same problem with Rey throughout the sequel trilogy, not really knowing exactly what these main characters want, which the other films that we've discussed have done a much better job of informing the audience of what's going on in the minds of those characters.
We can infer it. I mean, she was pretty much raised by Saw Gerrera, who was a militant anti-empire guy, to the point that the rebellion didn't want to work with him anymore.
And that raising is another really interesting point that I thought of, comparing her to Peter Quill, because they both had the same childhood of either seeing someone die right in front of them, and then they get separated out. Now they're living with, some kind of gang. And look at the personality differences between the two of them. They could not be more different people.
I think that's because, similar to with the Batman Begins example, one of them is being trained to be a soldier, right? Jin is being trained in this mercenary context of like, she's being trained in a military context. Then you look at Peter Quill and Bruce Wayne, who are individualists who seek out specific training, right? Even though Peter Quill is raised by the Ravagers, they do not adhere to what we would consider to be like a typical structured combatant training. Like, they're not an armed force, they're a group of thugs. Equally, Bruce Wayne goes out and he goes around the world and he teaches himself fucking martial arts and shit. The difference with Jin is that she is raised by someone who runs a mercenary, like they are mercenaries, they're not a gang. And I think that's the difference. That's why she functions well in the context of working for the general in the rebellion, is that she is a good soldier, and part of that training is her combat and her such and such and such and such. But it's the idea that like she is good at working within this particular structure, and she must learn to work outside that structure in order to achieve that goal by becoming the leader, and ditching some of the rules that she's become familiar with.
So and I keep asking this question because I think it's very important for the topic that we're talking about, which is, does the introduction work? Do we need to see her as a kid? Do we need to see her father taken? Do we need to have that loss, that initial trauma, in order for this movie to work? What would it be like if we started with her in prison, or we just started with her working in the rebellion? Like, what would that movie be?
Yeah, that's a good question. Like, because
Braver.
I don't think you don't see her loss come out nearly as much as you do with Peter Quill. Going back to that example, like anytime that the Walkman is brought up, because that represents his mother, you see him immediately, the switch flips, and you see how much he cares because of what it represents. But you never see that with Jin. All she has is the necklace her mother gave her, but all she ever does is like lightly touch it. You never see any example of, like I said before, of any example of what she is thinking, what's going on inside her head. And we could assume that she's feeling all that same trauma that Peter is, but we never see any examples of it.
Jin is like just all drive, which is great from like a plot perspective, but like if that's the case, if that's like kind of the only emotional crux of her character, you could have conveyed that opening scene in like a line of dialogue or something during a downbeat where she's like, yeah, Krennic killed my parents, and I don't know, I think it would have the same effect.
Yeah, and
honestly.
if you're trying to paint that character as hyper competent, just go down the Atomic Blonde route. Just give us this hyper competent warrior character and show them doing something and enforcing their will upon the world, and just let us infer the rest. I think it's what Pat said before. This movie, like, it is Star Wars, capital Star Wars. It is for everybody. The audience, nothing can be left to the assumption in these texts. Everything must be conveyed directly. And say what you will, like I think one of the biggest complaints and one of the reasons that Rian Johnson's take was less popular, aside from some of the plot elements, is just that Rian Johnson as a filmmaker relies a lot on inference. If you've seen Brick, you know that like there is a lot of things that Rian Johnson brings to bear in his texts that are so subtextual. And in fact, he even goes out of his way sometimes, if you've seen like Knives Out, where in adding text, he calls attention to meaning absent something else you would expect. So, like you have a scene where you've got a character who's going to do an action and you're expecting an outcome, and the outcome is robbed from you and something else happens, and the absence of the outcome is the meaning of the scene. He's very good at that stuff, but it's almost too much for your normal audience. They don't want to see risky movies. They want to feel comfortable. They want to be kind of cradled in that reliable, hero's journey. They want to feel like the surprises need to be safe. They need to feel comfortable. We need things explained to us. We need to understand why it's okay for us to root for this very violent character who gets locked in prison. We need to have things explained to us in a very kind of cogent way so that we don't accidentally risk some audience members not liking Jin. And that is, in my opinion, the biggest crime of this type of narrative. And this is my opinion. You can love these movies, and I enjoy aspects of them. But in my opinion, when it comes to these Hollywood blockbusters where we're playing it very safe, the thing they always do, and so Star Wars, is they cannot risk you not liking these characters, because if you don't like these characters, there's a chance the text might challenge you, and we can't take that risk.
I think part of that reason also is just, I think that scene was something that they had in their heads, and they said, oh, what if the story opened up with some, cool looking stormtroopers walking across this bleak and, this bleak, desolate wasteland, and they're going to go and kidnap someone. And then it almost felt like that was what the introduction was based around, was just this initial thought
visual
of, a visual, that they somehow decided to pen into the story because they needed some way to open the story. Because you're right, if you take out that entire opening scene, I'm not sure what you're left with. And another thought that I had based off what you were just talking about was the fact that Star Wars lays out in detail all of these things without trying to make the audience figure out subtext, I think goes back to the idea that most of the audience is not there to be a media critic. Like when I talk with my coworkers about certain scenes in movies, and they're like, you know, I absolutely love this. Like Fat Thor in Infinity War.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
They freaking love him. It makes me like viscerally angry that he is so depressed at the loss of his entire people that he is drinking himself, or a human, he probably would have drunk himself to death. Like they love the idea of a drunk who is depressed because they're not looking at it like that. They're just seeing, oh, he's funny.
Well, it's
he's
also
funny
very
looking.
it's very
he's
fat
different
phobic because they're laughing at the fact that he's fat. I think that movie manages to pull off being slightly less offensive than it could have been, because at the end when he becomes Thor again,
he stays fat.
He doesn't get thin, he stays fat. And so they get a pass on this one because he's still powerful, but it is very fat phobic in some ways. Yeah, people don't, that's the thing. Like, I want to be very clear. People don't think about this stuff in the way that we're talking about it very often because they don't do this for a living, right? The complication and the frustration is when you are someone that gets a huge budget to do this stuff, and you do this stuff for a living, and you run one of the biggest media companies on the planet, and you enforce this kind of ritualistic safety. It threatens the integrity of the medium. It threatens the integrity of, how do you get Villeneuve, millions of dollars to make a movie that doesn't make a return but is worthwhile because it was good art? How do you get A24 movies made on a budget that still look good? How do you get Dune fucking adapted into a movie? That's wild to me that they agreed to do that after Blade Runner. Like, there are still people out there pursuing these things, and we still have people in the common popular space creating things with artistic merit. You look at Dan Harmon, you look at even your South Park creators, people like that still taking risks, doing interesting things. But it's just so disheartening when they come so close in Rogue One so many times to being really interesting, and they just walk up to the precipice and then they make Thor fat, and it happens every time.
I mean, I feel like, that is depressing, that it's not the good stuff isn't the popular stuff, but at the same time, like, you get it makes the Nolans and the Villeneuves all the more sweeter, when that stuff does get made. And I don't know.
Yeah. All right, we're about to run up on our time for this section. Anyone have any final thoughts about this?
I like her scarf. It's like a cool outfit. Yeah.
It is. Yeah, she has a cool outfit. No, the whole design, like the whole look, I think it does a very good job of playing with this isn't the Star Wars that you thought you knew, but yet it kind of is.
I love
they
it.
still did something different. They still played with some of the ideas and didn't make it too Star Warsy and made it just like a generally better movie. I still think it is my favorite Star Wars movie to come out by Disney.
Yeah, I feel like, what you just said about, like, it's kind of Star Wars but a bit different. That's a lot of that is communicated through the art direction, which I feel like is the strongest thing about this movie. So, props.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that most people say that, I've heard a lot of people say that the second half, especially that final battle scene, is what they feel like is the most Star Wars thing they've ever seen, which is really interesting, that it's basically just the action of the X-Wing versus the TIE Fighter that people come back to as what defines Star Wars for them. And that's just a really interesting concept in and of itself.
I guess because at their heart, they're war movies. And that's plain dogfighting is the thing that made war movies popular. Like, Top Gun is popular for a reason. It's very easy visual language to follow. And Star Wars takes that and makes it sci-fi and interesting and adds laser swords.
Yeah.
I love a good laser sword.
Hell yeah.
All right, well, going into the break, I just need to mention that your mention of Dan Harmon there made me remember that we need to do a community podcast at some
don't
point.
Tempt me. Don't tempt me, boy.
Every time I watch an episode, I find more and more subtext to that is some of the best writing. It is top notch.
Dude's a genius.
All right, let's take a quick break. We'll come back and do my section on Sweet Home. I actually noticed. I don't know when I was. Oh, it was at one of our video conferences at work, and I looked up at the screen and I was like, "Man, I look angry." Like when I'm sitting there listening to people, I am like, I am zoned.
You do
in.
have resting anger face sometimes. Yeah, you do.
Can relate. Don't worry.
Mine's starting to get that way.
What?
I think it's like,
It's about to serenade
Yeah.
us.
While we wait,
Which is funny. I don't know how much y'all have watched of Sweet Home, but actually it was named that off of a song that one of the girls wrote on for guitar. And since it's like a post-apocalyptic kind of thing, the guitar only had 4 of the 5 strings, so she couldn't write a whole song. It was just a really neat scene that I don't know if I've ever seen before.
I like that idea.
Yeah. And we're back. We're going to start off with my section next, which is going to be going over a Korean film called Sweet Home. I chose this one to analyze because it was very entertaining. I thought it did a lot of things correctly, so that the things that it did wrong really jumped out at me. It was a really interesting genre combination. It was a foreign film, a creature horror film, post-apocalyptic survival. It was also a teen drama and a coming-of-age story. And looking at how they combined all of those different elements together by the end, I think it was a 10-part miniseries on Netflix. Looking at how they combined all those aspects at the end of it was really interesting. Again, not just looking at the stuff they did right, but the stuff that they did wrong, which really jumps out at you when you see, though this was done so well, these 3 episodes were done so well, and then this one part of this character arc just doesn't work compared to what we've seen so far. And looking at what doesn't work as a media critic can be much more informative for you as you're trying to learn how you're going to analyze these things, and seeing what doesn't work, why it doesn't work, can be so much more beneficial than looking at all of these things that did work so well. So just looking at the opening for this film, I'm looking for specifically a few things that I want to see present for a cohesive story, which are all things that we have seen talked about before, and the rest of these guys' media that they've talked about. We're looking for a world, we're looking for plot, we're looking for characters. And very quickly, which I probably don't need to do this now because they have all talked about these same 3 things in their shows, but I was going to jump over to The Prestige as an example of these 3 things done very correctly. For the world, we need to immediately get a basic understanding of where the story takes place, what time frame, what planet, what continent, what season, all that kind of stuff, just so mentally we have an idea, so our brains don't have to be trying to figure out where this is, so we can concentrate on the who and the how and all that kind of stuff. The Prestige was easy. It was old-timey London from the characters, the clothing, the accent from the narrator. It was very easy to figure out where, and very quickly your brain didn't have to focus on that anymore. So the next thing that I'm looking for is basic explanation of the plot and at least a visual introduction for the main characters. The Prestige explains the plot in 2 ways, through the narration and through the visuals. We see a magician doing an act, a man trying to see behind the scenes of said act, while a wise old man explains the 3 parts of a magic act. So we're only 60 seconds in at this point, and we already know where we are, who we're supposed to be paying attention to, and what the plot is based around. And more importantly, that beautiful opening is interwoven throughout the rest of the film. It's not just a standalone hook trying to grab your attention. It's an utterly integral part of the overall story of The Prestige. Now, if we take that same methodology of analysis and apply it to Sweet Home, we're looking at the introduction, trying to figure out the world, the plot, the characters, and how is that introduction going to apply through the rest of the film, much like we talked about Peter Quill and how that introduction with his mother influences his character progression throughout the next, not just that film, but the next several films. So the introduction for Sweet Home was very intriguing. This kid is beaten and bloody, his clothes are in rags, and he's walking barefoot through the snow while creepy-looking creatures are snarling and grabbing at him from the shadows. The camera is constantly moving, making the audience feel off balance and giving an energetic feeling to the scene. There's really great imagery with the monsters' bodies in the snowdrifts forming an outline of a skull. The music is haunting. It's a beautiful choral piece that slowly builds to epic boss battle music. The narrator's voice, I loved. It was very gravelly. It fits the dark tone perfectly. And the dialogue that he says and that the police officers say immediately introduces the concept of the story, that you have monsters, you have humans, they're not sure which is which, and the monsters are deadly enough for a single one to warrant all of this firepower. We get glimpses of what some of the monsters look like. We see that there are a variety of them. We see the creatures react violently as the young man is shot, making us wonder if they're somehow connected to him. This opening was powerful and interesting and left you wanting to learn more, all without us even learning the main character's name or hearing him speak. But did this opening give us the three things that we need as a foundation of the story? Do we know where it is? No. The only hint we have is the ethnicity of the main actor, and we would just kind of be guessing that it's somewhere Asian. We don't really know. We know that they are speaking a foreign language, but judging from the style of guns and armor, it could be set anywhere from modern day back to the 90s. Going to look at the plot, we get a decent idea of what the plot is about from the narration, like I said, both from the narrator and from what the police officers are saying over the radios to each other. But at the same time, the scene is also very confusing. Thinking about the plot, if you look at the Prestige, one character is explaining how a magic trick works, while another character performs a trick that a third character is trying to sneak around and figure out. So one character wants to perform, one character seeks understanding, one character is a kind giver of wisdom. We immediately know what all the main characters want, but we don't get that from Sweet Home. And even going further than just that prologue, we still don't know what the main character wants, even at the end, which is just an egregious failing when so much of the story is good with other character arcs, yet with the main character, we start off not knowing what he wants. We end up not knowing what he wants. And anyway, we have the old man narrating. We don't know what his role in the story is either. Usually with the opening scene, you want to have the main character either be the one who's narrating, you hear it from inside his head, or you want to have the narrator talking about the main character. But we are not introduced to who this kid is who's walking through the snow. The old man who's talking is another character that we meet later on. So it's very disconnected. And again, this whole thing is supposed to be the world, the plot, the characters, and the characters are not being introduced in a way that is going to be beneficial long-term for how everything is playing out. After the prologue ends and the episode begins, we then jump backwards in time and go back to meet the character, find out who he was and how he ended up being out in the snow, shot up by the military. And at this point, we're looking for those same three things. We're trying to figure out, where are we, who are these characters, and what do they want? And at this point, we get a good look at all of those things. We see they're in a rundown apartment building, obviously in an Asian country, based on the writing that's all over the banners everywhere. We're immediately introduced to the main character. We get a rough idea about his and several other main characters' personalities. We see with the main character that a defining attribute of his personality is his depression and that he is alone, which is something that we've now seen in three of our different stories that we've talked about of being the stranded lone orphan trope. And something that was interesting was talking about, or me thinking about how this was not a standard character introduction like we would have in a lot of stories, but that because this was jumping backwards in time, that we are seeing the climax of Act 3 or Act 5, depending on which structure we're talking about, and then we're backtracking to Act 1 to then establish the setting and meet the characters. And all of these things combined made this prologue just equally fascinating and frustrating for me, because it introduces these three main questions that the story never really answers. It's talking about what happens to the world. The other monsters don't look human, but he does. Why is he different? Who is he, and what does he want? And as I've already said, we never get an answer to that last one, skipping all the way ahead to the ending of the movie, fully analyzing how the prologue fits into everything and how it fits into the overall themes. When you finish The Prestige, you could see how the prologue fit in with the rest of the film, but the problem with Sweet Home is its prologue only stands on its own. The three main questions that it introduces are only partially answered, and the movie ends exactly as it began, where even the main character literally doesn't know who he is or what he wants. So as a viewer, I loved this story, but as a media critic, I definitely think that the entire prologue should have been cut, with it opening on what was then the flashback of meeting the character before all of the monsters actually show up. I think it would have been a much, much stronger opening to the entire thing. And another example that I had was looking at The Matrix Reloaded, and how the opening of that movie was also foreshadowing of what exactly was going to happen later in the film, but it was something that impacted Neo throughout the entire thing. He was constantly thinking, this is going to happen, I have to save her. It was constantly something that was influencing his decisions, but just like with The Prestige, we didn't have that tie-in in Sweet Home. That prologue was just something that seemed completely, utterly separate from the rest of the movie. And I don't know if it's like what we talked about before, where they just wanted to have some kind of action-based thing that was going to get the audience enthralled with the movie, which it definitely was. It definitely got my attention, but not in a way that was beneficial over the course of the whole thing for how the plot and the characters were going to be progressing. Some other things that I thought were interesting was that it didn't really set a proper tone to me, because the entire thing was more about how individuals are responding to turn into monsters, because everyone doesn't have to turn into a monster. Some people were able to keep their humanity about them, and it seemed to be more about, or one of the themes was about your personal strength and whether you could choose to be a good person or choose to be a monster. It seemed like they were saying, one of the themes is you could have a choice as to who you're going to be. But the opening is all about the military versus this one kid, and we never see the military anywhere until the very ending. So why would you open up establishing this plot which doesn't actually happen at all in the entire series? Having the military there at the beginning doesn't do anything aside from making the point that this is a huge problem, we need lots of guns, all that kind of stuff. I think that prologue needed to be the main character. Maybe he is the narrator. Maybe he is talking about some of those actual themes that we saw throughout the rest of the story. It didn't seem like the narration that was actually going on didn't connect to the overall themes that were being talked about. It was more like that the narration that was going on was only meant to introduce you to the story that there were monsters and we had to survive this catastrophe. But you could get all of that same information by completely cutting out the dialogue. So if all of that's superfluous anyway, then why not just skip it? That's pretty much the conclusion. There was that they just dropped a ball in so many places when there were so many great opportunities for character arcs, for plot development throughout this entire show. Because like I said, the fact that it could be a coming of age story, a teen drama, you've got romance stuff in there, the creature horror stuff, it's strong. The story is strongly based in depression, and this kid being so suicidal that he tries to commit suicide several times throughout the course of the film, and how that ties into him turning into a monster and going from wanting to end his own life to risking his life constantly to defend his new family that he has gotten. There are so many opportunities for amazing themes throughout the course of this show. But right from the very beginning, you could see the potential just being dropped because it was not properly established.
Let me touch on an idea that there's something that comes up a lot in particularly new media crit, when you move from that review space to talking about the kinds of things we talk about, is that anybody can have a good idea. Execution is the only thing that matters at the end of the day. And weirdly, when you were talking then, the thing you're describing, good openings, the thing that you're describing there when it comes to a narrator and setting up the themes and couching the stakes and letting us know what's going to happen. Weirdly, one of the best examples of that kind of opening is Shrek. You have Shrek reading to you about fairy tale stories, and he's actually telling you about the princess in the castle with the dragon, which is going to happen later. And then he's like, "That's fucking stupid," and then he slams the door, and then we get the tone for the story set really well. But we also learn about the world very quickly. We understand that this is a world with fairy tale creatures. This is an ogre who doesn't want to be any part of that. And we also learn there's a greater world beyond him. There's princesses and kings and military and such. And so, like, even though like Shrek is a kid's movie, its execution of that is very slick and deliberate because it knows that you're there for the fun and the jokes, and the story is there to support that. I feel like, and I didn't watch all the way through to the end. I watched like the first 30 minutes, I think, of this one, and it has that tone of like you could see that they knew why people did this kind of introduction, but it seems to me that they weren't quite sure why people do that kind of introduction. Like they're like, well, this is how people open stories, and so we're going to open our story this way, but perhaps failing to understand why it is that stories open that way. And that's kind of pretty common, I think you'll find with a lot of properties is writers grafting and stealing, which is good. You're supposed to do that. That's a big part of creativity, but perhaps failing to understand the reason something they're stealing is succeeding. And you'll see that with like, John Wick will come out and there'll be like a bunch of like B-movie kind of, not knockoffs, but like adjacent things. And some of them just won't understand why the property works at all. And this felt adjacent to that. A better example would be like A Quiet Place, or even Bird Box, even though people are pretty hot or cold on Bird Box, that achieve a lot of the same things with far more eloquence, and they tick a lot more of the boxes that you were describing as well.
When you're a creator, you don't really, you don't notice your affectation when you're creating stuff. You think, oh, if this works for this property by doing it this way, if I just replicate that, it'll have the same effect, and that's not the case. I only watched that prologue. So that scene in the chronology of the timeline, does that occur at the end of this series? Is that how it goes?
Yeah, so like in episode 10, that first sequence is the literal same thing that happens at the end. I think what they intended it as is that he is walking out there distracting the army, giving his friends time to escape through the tunnels. And you see him kind of walk up to a tunnel exit, which seems like it's on purpose, but then that doesn't tie into anything at the end. And I'm not sure, but so right before the end, there is an eclipse for some reason, and he gets like super magic demon powers, and then is able to beat the other uber bad guy that's there killing everyone.
I was gonna say, like, this, even just from watching that prologue, it felt very anime-esque.
It actually is based off of an anime.
Oh, okay.
I didn't know how important that was to talk about as far as the media crit goes, because just because it was based off an anime doesn't mean that the film adaptation should be different or should be worse. If something doesn't translate well from an anime to a live action, it should be changed.
I don't know if it's about better or worse. It's just about like convention, right? Like as a medium, anime has a handful of conventions that I find quite off-putting. Like certain subgenres of anime really just make my brain want to run away in the other direction. And so when it comes to adapting things, I think a big part of it is understanding what works in a particular medium doesn't work in other mediums, right? If you did a live action Akira, that probably would not work very well because there are things in that are quite hard to pull off in a visual medium. Conversely, doing a Matrix anime, for example, might work tremendously well, which it did because of the tone and context of what was already present. So I think you're right. It's less about whether or not it being based on the thing matters. It's about how you adapt into the medium you're actually creating and what you do and take with you. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Circling back to Pat's question there. So after he goes like full superpower demon, and then he comes back down, and then that's when the bad guys show up. In the midst of him going superpowered, he completely has his memory wiped, has no clue what his name is, has no clue who these people are, and then he goes out and seemingly sacrifices himself for them. So now we have the ending not make sense whatsoever, tied in with the beginning, which now the prologue doesn't make sense whatsoever. Like I said, there are so many spots where this entire story had promise, and then they just did weird stuff.
I feel like, and you're talking about a kind of a cyclical story where the ending, the writers really wanted to have it match the beginning.
Yeah.
And sometimes writers will do that to their own detriment, because like the idea of a cyclical story is really cool. We like that idea where we end where we begin. But if you force it, then that actually just kind of shows that nothing happened in the entire movie or the entire story. And now we have seen all of this character development to go nowhere, and it just gets super frustrating. The first example I can think of that is like what happened with the last season of Gilmore Girls. So it's just writers can make a choice to show that their characters are moving somewhere, but it definitely means that they can't go back to where they began. But if they know from the very beginning, I want the last scene to be the first scene, then they are completely narrowing down what can happen in between here and there. And they just have to make it fit. No matter what happens, they have to get to that last scene. And I don't think you can really write like that. I think you have to leave it a little bit more open-ended.
It's a really interesting thought. I think it becomes tremendously complicated in execution because the audience, I think it works really well when we don't have enough information in the whatever in medias res part is we're seeing in that, the bit that we're seeing from the end. As long as it's absent just enough context that we're not quite sure what we're seeing, we spend the whole time trying to piece it together. And then at the end, if it's surprising and recontextualizes everything we've seen, it can work really well. Like the final space is a great example where every episode opens with a snippet from the very end of the final episode where the main character is floating in space, running out of oxygen. And you slow, and like every little snippet you get a tiny bit more data about how he ended up there. And by the time you find out how he ended up there, it completely recontextualizes everything that's happened up to that point, and it works brilliantly. Conversely, if you know that your main character is going to live through the story, and your story has stakes of life or death, then you need to be playing in a different realm. Okay, you need to be playing with damnation or salvation. You can't be focused on mortality. And I think the issue is a lot of writers will, and I don't know if it's just like, it's also a good way to like keep people engaged because you know where it's going, feel safe, but it's also understanding what is it that you're showing at the start that's going to occur at the end, but not just what are you showing, but what is it communicating to the audience about the type of story that they're about to consume? And does that conflict with the dramatic tension of the narrative you've written? So if the narrative you're writing is like, will Jason Bourne survive all of these assassins and get to the end and find out who he is? If you saw at the start of Jason Bourne, the first Bourne movie, that he lives and gets part of his memory back, the rest of the story is very much undercut by that. Whereas perhaps, if you opened Casino Royale with, Bond, alone and mourning the death of Vesper, and then you kind of cut back and you had the whole movie occur, that'd work still quite well, I would think, because you're constantly recontextualizing, trying to piece together, what it was and how it happened and how this tragedy occurred. And so I think it really depends on the story it's placed in, but also like if the writer is able to fully grasp the purpose of the inclusion and whether it conflicts with their text.
I think Breaking Bad is like the gold standard for this, right? Like, I mean, the cold open is the end of the episode, and it establishes like, the first shot is like pants falling down. You're like, what the fuck? Like, and then it's cut to the interior of the car with pantsless man wearing a gas mask, like just chaos and shit going on in the back of the van. It's weird, it's esoteric, and it leaves you with a bunch of questions. And then when the episode starts, it's a completely different like setting and tone, like this, you know, quiet suburbia, and it starts to make sense, you know, the more you keep going through the episode, and then by the end, it doesn't retread any of that ground. Because you know, but it continues what you've seen in the beginning, and it's just like real, I don't know, economy of storytelling.
Yeah, I don't know. Like, do you think it's just like they weren't sure why they included it? Is it as simple as that? Like they just went, I don't know, other people do this?
It's hard to tell with shows like that where it's not like a movie where they're filming it all at once and they have all the script written at once, because from what I'm aware of, with most shows like that, they're writing the ending as they're filming the middle, you know? They're not really sure, I assume, where the story is going when they film that first section, which is extremely detrimental. That's one of the biggest reasons that a lot of people say that the sequel trilogy was a failure, was because from the very beginning, you got to know where you're going with the story in order to build all of those characters and all of that plot the right way. And they had no clue. Like even when they finished filming the third movie, like, you know, Daisy came out and said they had no clue how they were going to finish the film. They didn't know what the storyline was when they were actually filming. You know, is she Palpatine's granddaughter? No one really knows for sure. And if you don't know where the story is going, you cannot write a good story. And it could be that's what happened here.
I think something that we're not necessarily thinking about when it comes to conventions is because horror is a big part of this, right? Like we're supposed to be scared by these monsters. And horror film conventions often have an opening scene that doesn't necessarily relate to the rest of the movie, just for us to kind of get an introduction to what we are supposed to be afraid of right now. I can't think of any examples, because that's what I do, is not think of them. And but I know that this is a thing where in the opening scene, probably even before the titles, you have possibly an unrelated crew of people going to the scary place, being killed by the scary thing, and then you have the title, and then you have the actual main characters who are then going to interact with that scary thing later on.
Yeah, that's like every creature flick ever.
Exactly. Yeah. So like, is this just that? Are they playing with that convention, but trying to take the idea, but they're sticking with the main character and then trying to bring it around at the end? Are they trying to throw two conventions together?
Like another part, like I said, is it really feels like a lot of this was them not knowing how the end was going to happen when they filmed that prologue, because we see in that prologue, we see like, I'm going to say 6 different types of monsters. For the rest of the thing, you only see one monster at a time, because they like kill and eat each other. So you never see that many together, but in the prologue, you see a ton of them in the same space, which you never see again. You see all of them react. You see a reaction from them when he gets shot, like they are psychically connected to him. We never have any evidence of that anywhere else through the rest of the series. They establish these precedents that they don't stick to. The only explanation seems to me that they didn't know what they were doing when they first established those precedents.
So you think they were like working backwards maybe from this opening scene?
Or they were just you may have been out of the room when I said it, that with a lot of these type of stories, I think that they're probably still writing while they're filming episode 3, they're still writing episode 6, you know. So if you don't know where the story's going to end up, then you don't know where to start the story. If you don't know that they're not going to be cyclically linked, then you didn't know you shouldn't do that at the very beginning.
I have been thinking about this a lot today, because one of my favorite film critics, Patrick Willems, just did this series on trilogies and why some of them work and why some of them don't work. And his main thesis was that trilogies that work, like Lord of the Rings, work because you know the entire story before you begin filming a certain scene, any scene. And in the case of Lord of the Rings, they filmed everything at the exact same time, so you had proper continuity between all 3 movies. And you just knew, we already knew because of the source material where all 3 movies were going to go, and you didn't have to worry about writing movie 2 while filming movie 1. And then we have something like Pirates of the Caribbean, where movie 1 did great. We've got to make 2 sequels because trilogies are hot. People like them. And so they write movie number 2, and then it goes okay, but it ends on a cliffhanger. It's really dependent upon movie number 3. So what do we do now in movie number 3? I don't know. I guess we'll do this. And then it's not good, and now it ruins movie number 2 because movie number 2 is completely dependent upon movie number 3, and now we're just left with movie 1 and kind of 2 other movies. So, although they're up to like 5 or 6 movies now. I lost track.
I was a big fan of Dead Man's Chest.
I'm so angry at this. This is my Sherlock moment, okay? This is it. I'm so angry about this because Dead Man's Chest, I thought, had so much potential. It was such a fun movie. It ends on a great cliffhanger. I want to see what happens to this guy. And then they just mess it up. And I don't care about anything that happens in the 3rd movie, and it's all awful and sad.
That's literally the Luke Skywalker syndrome that people are going through with the sequel trilogy. They made him into a loser. Why do I care about any of the rest of these movies? You ruined 6 other movies for this one movie. Maybe people liked what Ryan did with The Last Jedi, but you ruined everything that came before it for us to like that.
I still don't get how the dice game works in Dead Man's Chest, but whatever.
Liar's Dice is a real game.
Oh, is
Actually,
it?
you can. I've played Liar's Dice recreationally.
Recreation. I'll send you. There's a few videos that explain it really well, Pat. But
All right.
yeah, I mean that's interesting. What you're touching on there is the idea of series as self-contained stories that contribute to a whole, which is a different philosophy than the thing you're describing, which is Hollywood trying to get you to watch all the movies. They're very different in their incepting mechanics, right? One of them is I'm trying to tell 3 stories that are directly related, but they are 3 contained narratives. They just continue the story of the same character. Okay, Lord of the Rings is that. Each of the stories has its own arc and its own complete stories within it, but they contribute to a larger whole. The issue you're describing with Pirates of the Caribbean is that the first film is a standalone narrative, then the other 2 are dependent on each other for their continuity and for them to kind of make sense. There isn't actually a resolution at the end of the second movie in a meaningful way to the plot of the second movie. It relies on the third one. And what you then do is you create this issue that happens a lot in Hollywood where if you fuck up the next one, you ruin the other one. Instead of what should happen, which is, well, we made 2 really good ones and then 1 mediocre one, but it's fine because we can make another one that's really good. Instead, because you've connected them so directly and they don't stand alone, it's like building a fucking tower of cards.
Yeah, you're not really making 3 movies. You're making 1 movie, and then you're making another movie that has 2 parts.
And the motivation there is money. It's because you know that if you end on a cliffhanger, people will come see the next one. And that's a big sort of... Look, not everybody that I've worked with in the publishing industry agrees with that perspective. There is obviously merit to the other approach, but I kind of philosophically err on the side of I'd much prefer a self-contained story that's has good artistic merit and is meaningful than I would something that ends on a cliffhanger that then forces me to consume the next one and rely on the creators to maintain the quality because it's hard to do.
Yeah, I mean, episodic exists. It exists all the time in media, and it's fine. It's great. One of my favorite book series is called the Dresden Files by Jim Butcher, and
they're good. They're great. I love those books.
They're like, I need more now, but that's fine. I can wait. But none of them depend upon the others, really. Like, yeah, there are the little themes that build up, but for the most part, you could skip book 4 and go on to book 5. And it's fine. Like you're gonna make it. You're gonna put all the pieces together. Harry Potter, same way. Like, yes, these themes build, and you're seeing the same characters move towards a certain point. But at the beginning of every book, you have him going to Hogwarts, and at the end of every book, you have him leaving Hogwarts to start the next story. And at no point do we need an artificial cliffhanger in order to move the story forward. Like, it just depends on where you feel like ending your story. And that's it. It's just a narrative conceit. So
absolutely.
Well, kind of circling back to the entire point of what we were talking about of the introduction, how we should look at them and analyze the introduction, and it coming back to establishing the world. What kind of world building are we seeing, and are we expecting to see throughout the rest of the movie? Who are the main characters? Do we have some kind of idea about the personality and what these characters want going forward, and how that might change throughout the rest of the movie? And what is a basic idea of the plot, and what we're immediately being introduced to as the plot, and how that might progress towards the rest of the movie. So do you guys have any other final thoughts about, if we're just looking at this brief introduction of a film or a show, what we should be looking for as we're trying to do these kinds of analyses?
I mean, I think it ultimately boils down to introductions are one of the most important parts of your story. They're the onboarding mechanism by which your audience or reader is going to either buy into the premise or not. They're the thing that what you should do from a craft perspective is write the whole damn thing, and then you come back and you focus on the introduction, and you dwell on it and you spend time building it up. Because if you can get it right, then you're setting the rest of your story up for success. And if you don't pay it enough attention, if you don't consider the whys and the hows of it, then you're kind of setting yourself up for a much harder job later on in the text. You need to set up your emotional arcs, so your internal genres. You need to set up your external genres. You need to, like you said, place us somewhere in a setting. It doesn't have to be a location we recognize, but give us the rules of that setting. How does it function? What should we expect? And then conduct some kind of setup for either objects in space or the way that the story is going to resolve. And I think if you can do those things and do them economically, and do them with grace and class, you're going to find that people begin the story and go, wow, I'm hooked. And it's one of those things that you don't notice when it happens, but much like with most writing, the way that you notice it is often in its absence. And that's very unfortunate.
And if you're super talented, the opening will be a microcosm of the movie to come, in terms of themes and or plot. David, you did an analysis of the opening for Logan a while back, which you pretty much, your conceit was that it's a microcosm of the movie as a whole. And yeah, that does it really well.
Yeah.
And I guess my takeaway is that an opening for a movie should not be able to be removed and have the movie still make sense. It should be so significant that it really establishes both theme, characters, and stakes in the movie, to the point that you can't just take it out because it's unnecessary introduction.
Yep. Okay, well, that pretty much wraps up everything for this hopefully first section of many sections. Fingers crossed we'll be able to go through an entire film looking at each part of it. I think we had talked about having world building be possibly the next subject that we look at. But as a final pitch, if everyone wants to go around and give your website or whatever again, and then maybe pitch any other channel or artist, critic that you feel like everyone should know about. David,
so you can find all of my novels at maynardtrigg.com, 2 G's for Trig. It's the best place to go and help support me. Otherwise, all of our content is on zeroindent.com. If you like this kind of conversation, you will love the articles there. It's where we house all of our media crit. A media writer that I would love to shout out that I think everybody should be reading is Rob Zacny from Waypoint Radio / Vice Games. Rob Zacny is one of the most talented media writers alive and working today. I would encourage you to pursue his work. And in fact, all of the Vice Games / Waypoint crew are all tremendously talented.
Yeah, if you like this kind of stuff, the stuff at Zero Indent, I have a podcast called Method to the Madness. Film analysis within a philosophical framework. If you're a fan of Wisecrack and their podcast, Show Me the Meaning, it's pretty much has the same structure as that. And yeah, in terms of shouting out people, I don't know, just video essayists, Channel Criswell. Wait, no, they're not called that anymore. The Cinema Cartographer, I believe, is what they're called now. Every Frame of Painting, Just Right. They're all great people for narrative theory.
Well, my podcast is Diamonds in the Rough Draft, and go to it for just like a really nitty gritty examination of what writing is supposed to do, and none of it is film related, although I do have some scripts that I could totally do and I haven't done yet, so I might actually delve into that. But it's more about looking at old writings and trying to pick out the good and get rid of the bad and see what is this story trying to do. And it's really just a critique session between my wife and I of saying, what can we turn this story into? How can we turn it into something that is actually worth consuming? Plus, as part of the shtick, we drink a new local beer and talk about it every time. Because draft, I don't know, it was enough, and it gives me an excuse to buy local beer. So it's the best idea I've ever had.
I love it.
Yeah. And then I already mentioned him once, but Patrick Willems is one of my favorite guys that I do like to watch. And I guess the pragmatism of what he does really speaks to me, because there's a lot of, when you get into critique, there's a lot of hoity-toity kind of like arts. But sometimes it's nice to be able to apply it to something, and a lot of my favorite critics always kind of bring it back towards like, we are people. What can this teach us as people about how we interact with other people? And I feel like his channel does a really good job of that, of showing us at the end of the day, like, this is why we consume art. This is why we are doing this. This is what we are trying to learn, and how we are trying to grow.
And obviously, if you're watching this, you've already found my channel, so no need to plug that. As someone that I would want to recommend, there's actually a music channel on YouTube that's run by Samuel Kim. Really love. He does some really unique compositions. He'll take like the Winter Soldier theme and combine that with a different theme from like the Batman theme. He'll combine the two musical themes together in some of the most brilliant ways that I've ever heard. Really love his stuff.
Is he the one who did the song, the Witcher song?
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. He's good. I've heard.
Yeah, apparently I talk about him a lot. So
you just sent it to me every day until I listened to it. Okay.
I think it would also be remiss of us not to shout out Ryebold. We mentioned him a few times. Ryebold on YouTube. I think Darth and I are both huge fans. Go check out his work as well.
Yeah, that is interesting. How I have to tell him how much we talked about him while he wasn't here.
He'll be chuffed.
Yeah, like the man, the myth, the legend. All right. Well, appreciate everyone joining, and we will hopefully do this again very soon.
Absolutely.
See ya.
See ya.
All right, guys. Have a good afternoon. Is there an off button?
There is. I just gotta find it.
All right.